The procession moved along the road. The accompanying knights on foot walked ahead of everyone. Behind them was a carriage drawn by a pair of horses. The loaded carts brought up the rear. The carriage itself showed with all its appearance that a significant person of this kingdom was traveling in it. 2 flags fluttered above her, and looking out the cabin window was a charming brunette with delicate features and slanting almond-shaped amber eyes. It was Adelaide Gottroff. The girl was a high-class attacking magician who repaired the damage to the portal descending from the heavens, and at the same time the crown princess of the Gottroff Empire. The woman gave the girl a letter. She reported that it was with a proposal from Emperor Egmont, and she assured her daughter that she could become an empress. The girl said that she could see how worried her mother was that she did not want to leave her here. The woman was surprised that this happened to her daughter. After all, I expected her to react approvingly. Adelaide was silent. She was clearly deep in thought. Then she waited for her mother's explanation, giving her the opportunity to clarify what she had said earlier. The woman leaned closer to her daughter, and she explained that she talks to her about that day every time it was hard for her. She said that then, if she had left her brother Lucio to die, she would have become Empress of Gottroff. The girl asked her mother to stop. The woman asked Adele to remember that she had a duty to her only brother. The mother was sure that she would certainly be devoted to Lucio, but she also asked her to think about what would happen to her future children. In response, the girl only widened her eyes in surprise at such speeches. The woman also asked her daughter to think about what would happen to those close to her. After all, they would hardly have shared such a position with her. And she asked her if she herself did not doubt deep down. Adelaide thought and became sad. The corners of the lips noticeably drooped and the gaze stopped at a point on the floor. And the mother continued to convince the girl that her very existence was extremely dangerous for the Gottroff Empire. Therefore, for the sake of her brother and her home, Adele had to leave. And now the heroine of our story was riding in a carriage. A traveling cloak with a hood was thrown over her shoulders, and the face has an expression of sadness. After a while, Adele opened a small black chest. The girl pulled out a photograph from it. It showed a blonde man in uniform. That guy was the current ruler of the Egmont Empire, and the man she will marry. And his name was Karl Ulrich Egmont. After looking at the image for a while, Adele put the photo back into the chest. But then her attention was drawn to a bundle of paper folded in 4 that was lying on the floor of the carriage. The girl picked it up and unfolded it. This was information about the concubine of Karl Ulrich Egmont. Her name was Diane Poitiers, 29 years old. Adele folded this document too, placing it in a black chest. She sat and thought. This infuriated her. That she left her native land, crossed the deep seas and arrived on this continent, where it was a foreign land and there was no one she could trust. The girl went damn far from her home, and she was supposed to become the empress of this land. The palace was illuminated by the bright rays of the sun, and because of this it seemed to glow with golden tints. A blond man was sitting at the table in the office. He carefully examined the image in the photograph. The man was surprised by the expression on the girl's face. He considered how it was possible to send a photo to his future spouse with such an expression. And I would prefer it to be done with a sweet smile. But then he thought that this was some kind of hint to himself that the girl was coming here not as his wife, but as an empress. Karl said to himself that even the photograph did not convey all the audacity of the girl that was captured on it. He considered this a sad circumstance, and he thought that it would be good if she came here as his woman. The carriage continued its movement. The knights accompanying her followed behind. Adele sat at the carriage window and looked out, straightening her raven hair. A month later, the girl drove up to the gate. The weather was sunny and the sky was pleasingly blue. A handsome young brunette man with sharp facial features and dark blue slanted eyes. This is Lionel Valdor. He was the second son of Duke Valdor. Now he held the post of Minister of Defense and Commander of the Guard in the Empire. And now I watched as the carriage with the high-ranking guest appeared on the horizon. The henchman told the commander that it seemed that those whom they were supposed to meet had already arrived. He answered them that he saw everything himself, and he ordered to move forward. Lionel quickly and deftly jumped on his horse and galloped off like the wind. Our heroine, having pulled back the curtain of the cabin of her carriage, saw a group of 6 horsemen rushing towards them. One of them got ahead of everyone else. Adele asked the woman how long they had to go. She replied that the gate they saw was the first, and the second one was still an hour away. The girl thought about it. She said that she would like to change her clothes, and she pulled the curtain on the window tighter. The carriage stopped at Adele's request before reaching the gates of the Empire. Dismounting nearby, Guard Commander Lionel Valdor approached them. A woman in a long, modest black dress and a dark traveling cloak with a hood stood by the carriage, waiting. The Minister of Defense knocked on the carriage door. He asked for forgiveness. He introduced himself with his name and who it was, and that he came to accompany the guest. The girl was silent. The accompanying maid called the princess, and she asked permission to open the door if it was already ready. When the door opened, Lionel saw a beautiful brunette dressed in a pantsuit. The commander was fascinated and speechless, and his amber eyes simply drove him crazy. Coming out of his trance, Lionel asked for forgiveness, and holding out his hand, he helped the girl get out of the carriage. It was only then that he noticed her clothes, which also amazed him. She was wearing pants. The brunette modestly thanked him for meeting her, and she introduced herself as Adelaide Gottroff. The commander in response also politely introduced himself that his name was Lionel Valdor. The girl said that it was not easy to travel here for 2 months, sailing on a boat and sitting in a carriage, and Adele asked the commander if he had an extra horse. He was a little dumbfounded and asked why she needed a horse. The girl said that she would like to ride a horse. The commander asked himself why she dressed like that. One of those who met her assured Her Highness that military horses were not at all docile, and he believed that this could pose a danger to her. The girl asked in surprise how he could worry about her, Princess Gottroff. Adele quickly jumped onto the horse and, pressing herself against his withers, commanded, "Butt!" and galloped off. The captain was horrified. He realized that it was not in vain that she insisted on her opinion. After all, I saw what a wonderful rider she was. Having made a considerable circle, the girl got off the bay. They both seemed to be enjoying the ride immensely. Adele stroked and patted the noble animal on the withers and praised him. Commander Valdor quickly approached the guest from the Empire. The hem of his cloak fluttered in the wind. Having caught up, he turned to Her Highness and asked if she felt better. Adele answered in the affirmative, saying that it was thanks to his permission to go for a ride. She admitted that she would like to ride a little more, but the girl realized that it would be problematic if she appeared in the palace in this form. The captain agreed with her opinion that she should have taken a carriage to the palace. Adele, heeding common sense and not wanting scandalous conversations around her person, said that she would do so. An accompanying maid was waiting for the girl near the carriage. She bowed her head at the sight of the mistress. The brunette glanced sideways at the commander. She thanked Lionel Valdor for adding color to her boring day, and she expressed the hope that they would still have a chance to ride horses together. The young man looked thoughtfully after Princess Adelaide Gottroff for a long time. He thought that such an unusual woman was becoming the Empress of Egmont. Emperor Charles of Egmont was sitting in his study. In front of him were business papers. There was a knock on the door. A servant entered timidly. He reported to the master that a maid had arrived from the Ivory Palace. The blonde asked what happened, rubbing his temple with a finger and looking sideways at the servant, behind whose back the maid was stomping. The girl timidly said that Mrs. Diana had sent her to ask him for help. Crowns of various designs and inlays lay on cushions of red satin. The blonde took one of them in her hands and twirled it, examining it, appreciating its appearance. Footsteps were heard outside the door. This alarmed the girl. Soon a blonde in a fluffy red dress appeared on the threshold. This was Elizabeth Ulrich, Grand Duchess, half-sister of the Emperor and the only woman in the ruling family. Diana shyly and politely greeted the Grand Duchess as she greeted her, and she asked what brought her to the Ivory Palace. The Duchess glanced angrily at the jewelry, and she sharply asked what it was and how she should understand it. She asked Diana whether the Emperor himself had given it to her, or whether she no longer needed his permission to enter the imperial treasury. The blue-eyed concubine answered her negatively, and she assured that she was simply choosing a crown for the Empress. Elizabeth considered it wrong for the concubine to personally choose the crown for the future wife of the monarch, and she assured that if the Gottroff Empire became aware of this, there could be disagreements. Diana, without answering, became sad. The Duchess took one of the crowns and, turning it in her hands, asked for opinions on this matter. Elizabeth argued that only the Emperor's sister could make a better choice than a concubine. The blue-eyed girl cleared her throat a little and apologized, and she reminded her that she was the only divorced woman in their empire, and therefore she did not have the right to choose a crown for the Empress. Diana claimed that, as she knew, such women did not participate in preparations for someone else's wedding. For this truthful remark, the girl was called insulting names. Suddenly the door swung open, and the angry Emperor Charles suddenly appeared on the threshold. He angrily asked what the two of them were doing here. The Duchess lowered her gaze, and Diana thought to herself that his appearance was very timely. The concubine timidly told His Highness that she was infinitely glad to see him. The emperor glanced sideways at his sister. She realized that it was a trap, cunning as a fox of a girl. Carl asked what they were doing here. Elizabeth asked her brother in surprise that he had so nothing to do that he pushed the affairs of the empire into the background in order to follow on the heels of his mistress. The girl said that he still wouldn't believe her, that she didn't do anything with Diana. The concubine wiped the tears from her white cheeks with her fist. The emperor asked why Diana was crying then. The girl looked up at the emperor with a shining gaze. She asked him to stop, and she assured that the Duchess was not to blame for anything. Diana assured that she tried her best to be useful to His Majesty and prepared for his wedding, but apparently her efforts were not to the liking of the Grand Duchess. Elizabeth muttered through her teeth that she had become extreme again, grabbing an innocent man by the throat, and she told her brother that his beloved girl was simply showing off under the guise of preparing for the wedding. Carl did not share his sister's opinion. He said that in the imperial family there was no worthy woman who would be involved in organization, and instead of gratitude, Diana is confronted with complaints. He argued that this was unacceptable given the reputation of the Duchess herself. The girl replied that it was the same as the topic of her divorce that had been raised. The emperor suggested stopping the discussion on this. He said that he was warning her for the last time that he entrusted all the troubles with the wedding to Diana, and he informed the Duchess that she would have to stand aside and just watch what was happening. Elizabeth said that she could no longer stand this place, and as soon as the wedding ceremony is over, she plans to immediately leave for her homeland. Carl did not respond to his sister's caustic words. He simply turned sharply and walked away. Diana called out to His Highness. He froze in the doorway as soon as he crossed the threshold of the room. Then the two of them walked away together, and the Grand Duchess was left alone. She sat for a long time in front of the decorations of the imperial treasury with her eyes closed, thinking. Diana knew that everyone considered the emperor the sun, and the closer to him they were, the more rays they received. And the girl believed that if Elizabeth was the emperor's sister, then this did not give her the right to disturb him. And she considered herself his moon, an integral companion. The Duchess believed that Diana blindfolded her brother so much that he could not see reality. She wondered whether the future empress would endure this. The girl sat on the sofa and stroked the man on his blonde head. He was lying on her lap. She told the emperor that it was time for him to go. Carl answered her with his eyes closed that he would like to lie like that for a little longer. Diana thought the man was so beautiful. She admired his forehead, eyelashes, nose, lips. She liked absolutely everything about him. The girl quietly said her lover's full name. Even it seemed beautiful to her. The concubine told herself that the man was hers, and she never intended to share it with anyone. Soon the man sat up abruptly and called out to Diane. It seemed to her that he had overheard her selfish thoughts. She looked at the emperor with a guilty look from her blue, bottomless eyes. The girl asked His Highness to forgive her, and she wiped the tears from her face with her fist. Carl asked her why she was crying, and he suggested that this could be due to the Duchess's rude behavior. The concubine denied it, shaking her head. She said that she had doubts whether the future empress would like her. Diana asked if she should have left the palace, and she said that she would gladly do this if it was convenient for His Majesty. Carl assured his beloved that the empress would not become a threat to her. He turned to the side and rubbed the bridge of his nose with his fingers. The girl wiped her eyes from excess moisture. He asked her to forgive. After all, it seemed to her that because of her, His Majesty was constantly having problems. She looked devotedly into the man's eyes, and she assured that he was the only one in the world for her. Diana allowed herself to hug the man, pressing her whole body against him. Na told him that even if he got an empress, the main thing was that she had him. The man's face remained expressionless. Pressing her cheek against his chest, the girl told herself that no one would dare take her love away from her, let it even be his legal wife. Diana was sitting on the sofa with an unfolded notebook on her lap. There were 2 teapots on the table, and there was a guy sitting opposite her. He asked her in surprise whether she really chose a formal suit for the emperor. The guy was the same blue-eyed as Diana. He said that there were only a few days left before the wedding, and he wondered how she could remain so calm. The girl looked coldly at her brother. 2 maids stood under the door, heads down, but ready at any moment to be at the service of their masters. Diana paid special attention to the blonde. She told the one that she was seeing her for the first time, and she ordered her face to be raised. The maid looked up with her light blue eyes. Dana noted her soft blonde and blue eyes. I thought that even though the girl didn't really stand out, but I thought it was worth being more careful. Out loud, she ordered everyone to leave the room. She said that she would like to talk to her brother alone. The maids obediently left immediately. Diana told her brother that she had already warned him, so that he does not take blondes with blue eyes as maids. The guy retorted that there were many such girls in the empire, and he refused to sit and choose them based on their appearance. Diana answered coldly to her brother that he would have to do this, and she asked if he understood her. The blonde gave in, insisting that he understood everything. The girl also asked him to control himself in the presence of servants, and if he thought that he was not capable of this, then it was better not to come at all. By the way, my brother asked Diana if she was sure she could stand it. He knew that the Empress was an unusual woman because she was Princess Gotroff. The girl asked what he was hinting at. The guy explained that although the Emperor behaved as if he could not live without her, but he did not allow her to take the place of the Empress. Diana was surprised by her brother's speeches, and he continued the thought that the princess, at least for the sake of her reputation, would try to get rid of the concubine in her person. The girl said that according to rumors, the future Empress was very beautiful, and her brother asked in response how many times he told her that she needed to get pregnant before the Emperor got married. Diana started yelling at him. She asked in surprise whether he really thought it was so easy. The guy's face was tense. After all, he knew firsthand about his sister's character, and Diana, straightening her hair, confidently told her brother that the Empress would not receive any privileges, and when he asked what they were talking about, she assured that His Majesty was very hostile to the word Empress. But the guy still couldn't understand his sister. She explained, smiling slightly, that Carl did not make her his wife because he loved her so much, but my brother called it nonsense. He assured the girl that she did not know men at all, and he was sure that love was cooling, and the Emperor's love for her would also be no exception. Diana insisted that she knew this. She shared the idea that love for a living person always subsides, but she was also sure that love for a dead man would never go away. The girl opened the medallion on her neck. There was a portrait of a blonde with blue eyes. She told her brother that the Emperor saw his late mother in her. Diana said that the woman died because of the tyranny of the previous ruler, and therefore, the future wife is already hated by the Emperor even before their personal meeting. The concubine closed the medallion. She asked her brother if he now thought that the ruler's love for her might cool over time. The guy looked at his sister in amazement, and she asked which option in his opinion was better. An empress who only has a title, or she, who has the Emperor's love and power. Further events take us to Egmont's palace, where the day after Adelaide arrived there was a line to greet her. All this was done in order to show oneself well in front of the future Empress. But even after the end of all the meetings, already at sunset there was no visit or any news from the Emperor himself. Adele thought that he never came after all. The maid stood in front of the girl looking down at the floor. She said that she was very tired today, and she ordered them to prepare a warm bath for her. She ordered that if more guests arrived, they would be sent back. Let them come tomorrow already. Adele was wearing an underdress and soft slippers. She already felt relaxed and was preparing to rest. But then suddenly an unfamiliar blonde with blue eyes, dressed in a yellow fluffy dress, appeared in front of her. The girl looked directly at the future Empress, without lowering her gaze. Adele asked herself who she was, and she said out loud threateningly that this was her bedroom, and that all guests were to be escorted to the living room and wait for her there. The brunette couldn't understand why this girl was with such confidence in someone else's bedroom without her owners. Meanwhile, the blonde happily greeted the princess, and she introduced herself that her name was Poitiers. Our heroine remembered that paper about information about the concubines of Emperor Charles. Adelaide said all her clothes were wet because her hair was wet. She asked to dry them. The maid answered the princess obediently. The girl sat down near the dressing table, and the maid was already bringing her a large terry towel. Diana thought to herself that the Emperor would not like such a lady at all. Adele noticed that the uninvited guest was grinning slightly. The blonde offered to help the princess dry her hair. She coldly asked if the girl was one of the local servants, and if not, she couldn't understand why she wanted to do it. Adele sternly asked what if the girl was not a servant? What then was she doing in her bedroom without permission? The blue-eyed girl said that she asks for forgiveness if she offended anyone, and she assured that she just wanted to tell her something. Diana assured that she would like to talk about the Emperor's tastes. She was sure that the princess would be interested in what the Emperor liked. The blonde raised her finger and twirled it. She said that Carl liked wavy hair, And since Adele's hair was now wet, she should have dried it so that waves appeared. The concubine said that the princess looked so pale that she should have applied rouge to her cheeks. She stroked her cheeks, as if imitating the movement of a sponge. Adelaide thought in rage how this girl even dared to say such a thing to her. And he grabbed her by the hair and began to shake her painfully and forcefully. Letting go of the blonde and turning her back, the princess ordered her to bring her a glass of alcohol. Adele sat down on the chair. She said that they said that there was a popular drink in this empire, and she became interested in trying it. She said she would drink a little and go to bed. The princess was surprised that the blonde came to tell her something that was not asked of her. Diana, languidly closing her eyes, answered that the princess did not know the emperor's tastes, so she wanted to give her a hint. The brunette asked if the uninvited guest was working part-time in different places, conveying their preferences to different people. The concubine could not find anything to answer to such a barb, and Adele said that if this was the case, she asked that her wishes be conveyed to the emperor. She was holding a glass of wine in her hands, and she said that she likes men who say to their face what concerns them personally. The girl assured that she had never betrayed her principles in her life, and did not intend to do so, and therefore she believed that there was no need for her to listen to information that was not useful to her. And the princess invited the blonde to adapt herself to her tastes. Diana looked sad and guilty. Adele said that she was free and could already go. The blonde just bowed her head submissively. Diana quietly said that she apparently made a mistake in coming here, and she asked to forgive her. She sweetly wished the girl a pleasant holiday, and she said that if any questions arise, to call her at any time. Diana said that on her orders the servants would take care of the girl, and turned around and left with the permission of the princess. After she left, the princess had a headache. She remembered that last phrase of the concubine, and she had the feeling that she was the mistress here, and she was her guest. Adele was surprised that she had just arrived and immediately met the mistress of Emperor Charles William Egmont. Finally, the wedding day arrived, but the emperor never came to meet the princess before the ceremony, and these rumors spread throughout the empire. Adele called him offensive names, and I thought there was a whole drama here. She looked at her wedding dress, and she understood that this Diana Poitiers was in charge of all affairs in the palace. The girl was angry that they made it look like she was there by accident. The maid called to the princess, and pointing to the product, she said that it was her crown made of white gold. She asked if she wanted to try it on. The girl helped put the crown on Adele's head. The brunette frowned at her reflection in the mirror. The maid asked if the princess liked her, and she asked if there was any ordinary gold. She insisted that she preferred the gold color rather than silver. Adele took the crown off her head. She said that there was still time before the ceremony and ordered to change her crown and bring her a gold one. The emperor stood next to Diane. He called out to her. The girl's hands were shaking. She looked sad and depressed. The girl looked up at His Majesty with her blue eyes. Trails of tears flowed down her cheeks. Diana asked for forgiveness with her head bowed, and the emperor remembered a woman as small and weak as she. Charles thought that he wanted to protect this woman from the empress while ignoring this terrible woman. When he thought about the word empress, he shuddered. The concubine told her lover that Adelaide was beautiful and noble. She said that someone like her would look like an ordinary palace maid next to the princess. The girl knew that Karl's own mother was an ordinary servant, and I hoped that these words would hurt him greatly. The emperor asked the girl perhaps on the day when she went to greet her. She said that nothing happened between them. Diana, with tears in her eyes, assured that when the princess asked who she was, she could not answer her. And this made her very sad. The concubine said that it was important for her that he be close only to her, but she understood that she wanted too much. The girl began to breathe frequently through her mouth. She seemed to be suffocating, due to an attack of suffocation. The emperor was worried about her and asked her to breathe more slowly. Diana began to go limp. The emperor sat down next to her. He loudly ordered to call a doctor. The girl had tears running down her face. Through attacks of suffocation, whimpering, she asked His Majesty not to leave her. The girl lost consciousness, falling on Karl. He tried to hold her, kneeling in front of her. People were whispering why the emperor was not there, and it was unclear why he was so late and there was no news from him. It was his wedding after all. It was assumed that this Poitiers could have detained him. The bride stood at the altar alone. Adelaide silently scolded her careless future husband. She couldn't afford to be ridiculed. The clock showed 20 minutes after noon, but the emperor still did not appear. The princess was sad. Among the crowd of strangers, she felt lonely. She didn't even have anyone to ask what was going on here. She felt as if she was on a battlefield without a weapon. The girl remembered the instructions she received at home. The woman told the princess that she was the only person she could trust there. She said that her honor and dignity were only in her hands, and she asked me to keep them. And now the girl mentally thanked the nanny for her kind instructions. And I decided that I needed to control myself. Adelaide turned her head and said, "Someone, bring me a chair. I will sit down before the emperor comes." The girl thought that even the aristocrats who were present here were sitting. So why did she have to stand? The ladies whispered, not understanding what the princess was going to do. Two men brought a chair with upholstery and placed it next to Adelaide. The bride immediately sat down decorously. She seemed to do it with the utmost dignity. The guests were extremely surprised that the bride would wait for the emperor groom while sitting, and our heroine had a satisfied expression on her face. She seemed to relax and smiled slightly. The man told the other that the girl was quite confident in herself, and he was sure that she would do what was convenient for her. The blue-eyed brunette looked at the princess, and she caught his eye on her. Our heroine tried to remember where she saw him and what his name was. Then she realized it was Lionel Valdor, and the man was delighted with the princess. He told himself that he could not take his eyes off her. After all, in the blink of an eye, the girl turned this chair into a throne, and all the nobles were now confused. One lady got up from her seat and said that it was probably worth saying hello to the future empress, and the blonde in a delicate lilac dress, coming closer, greeted Her Majesty. She introduced herself as Elizabeth Ulrich Grand. She said that she really wanted to meet her. The man with silver hair also approached. He said that it was a great honor for him to meet Her Majesty in person, and he introduced himself that his name was Ulrich Desponte. Our heroine said that she didn't even know how to present herself, and she said that this wedding would end quickly so that she could confidently introduce herself. And the girl modestly but with dignity introduced herself as the future Ulrich Egmont Adelaide. Duchess Elizabeth assured that the princess had already become the empress of this country. The man echoed her, and he said that she could pronounce this surname with confidence. The nobles in the hall supported this decision unanimously. All the guests smiled at once. Adele said everyone could sit down too, and making a gesture with her hand, she invited everyone to wait for their emperor together. The Duchess thought that the princess was not so simple. After all, immediately after meeting them, she indicated where they belonged. With just one phrase, Adele made it clear to everyone who was in charge, and Elizabeth grinned contentedly. She wondered what her brother Carl's expression would be like when he saw his bride. The doors opened, letting in a stream of fresh wind. A piece of blue, clear sky seemed to accidentally peek inside. Adele glanced sideways at the emperor. The man walked with his lips pressed tightly together. The hem of his white cloak embroidered with gold fluttered. People bowed their heads. Carl stood dumbfounded next to the bride, and he was extremely surprised that she was sitting while he was standing. After a short pause, Adele stood up. Turning her head towards the servant, she ordered the chair to be removed. "Yes, Your Majesty," came the answer. Soon 2 men were removing furniture from the aisle to the altar, and the girl was the exact personification of the word empress. Carl greeted the bride with restraint as he drew level with her. She returned his greeting with the same restraint. The princess looked appreciatively at the man who was soon to become her husband. She noted his graceful face, and I thought that that portrait did not convey all this. The girl could not understand why the emperor and her future husband had such a cold look. After all, he was the one who was late. This irritated her greatly. A servant presented Her Majesty with her wedding bouquet. Delicate colored roses and snow-white lilies created harmony. The guy quietly told Carl to take the empress's hand and walk forward with her. The blonde narrowed his eyes. He walked past the girl without even deigning her with a glance or a gesture. Adele was disappointed by such a cold attitude towards herself from her future husband. The nobles in the hall were also confused. It was surprising that the emperor refused to hold hands with the empress. Our heroine drooped, and her hands, clenched into fists, began to tremble. The maid once again reminded her about the bouquet. Adele waved her hand and said that she didn't need him. The girl caught up with the groom and walked in step with him to the altar. Carl quietly told her not to expect much from him. I asked her to go forward and not stop. Adele asked what he meant. The man was angry that she asked Diana if she was a servant. She replied that she came into her chambers without permission. That's why she was interested. Carl said that Diana was not a servant, and he ordered to be careful with expressions towards her. The priest spoke a traditional speech, and the emperor quietly told the bride at the altar that they would not have a wedding night today. He told her not to wait for him. The girl turned her head to the emperor, squinting at him. The priest said that they must take an oath of allegiance to each other. Adele thought that there could be no talk about the oath of allegiance, when at the altar the emperor declared to her, his bride, that she would not be his woman. The priest said that from now on the bride becomes Adelaide Ulrich Ekmont. The girl was incredibly infuriated by all this. But now nothing could be changed. Diana looked out the window. She asked the question whether the emperor's wedding ceremony was completed. The maids told her that it was all over, and they still offered the hostess lunch. After all, she had been refusing food for several days. The brown-haired woman asked the maid in surprise if it was true that Lady Diana had not eaten anything on purpose, and she clarified that she simply couldn't do it. The girl humbly bowed her head and asked the mistress for forgiveness. This simply infuriated her older colleague. She asked what she was taught in general, but the girl without understanding said that she was not to blame for anything. Lady Diana touched the maid's shoulder and asked her to move away. She narrowed her eyes into tiny slits and looked directly and angrily at the new servants. The girl fell to her knees in front of the blonde. She begged to forgive her, apologizing. She insisted that she was new and therefore made a mistake. Diana lifted the maid's head by the chin with her hand. She told her that she would explain to her what she said wrong. The girl seemed encouraged by this, and hope flashed in her eyes. The blonde reminded her that she said "Madam," and she asked if she was now in the house of some minor aristocrat. And was she a commoner in her eyes? The maid was trembling, and Diana proudly declared that it was a palace, and she was his owner. And she was surprised that the servants dared to call her Madam. She forcefully grabbed the girl by the hair at the back of her head and began to shake her forcefully. The maid was trembling and crying. She assured that next time she would not allow such an oversight, and she asked to forgive her. Diana let go of the girl's hair, and she said that she was the mistress of the Ivory Palace, and she ordered from now on to call her mistress. Turning her back, the blonde said that there were so many crazy people here that it just drove her crazy. She said that she needed to lie down, because she had not eaten for a couple of days and was not feeling well. The governess suggested that the hostess call the doctor. Diana agreed that she would do so, and she asked me to remember that she did not get out of bed. Evening fell over the palace, and in the endless sky, myriads of distant stars lit up. Our heroine was sitting in an easy chair. She reflected that she couldn't trust anyone here. After all, even the servants had to be treated with caution. There was no relationship between Ekmont and Gottroff for a long time. This was due to the fact that they were separated by a huge sea, and there was no need to encroach on foreign lands that were so far away, much less send spies to each other. Therefore, now Adelaide was extremely lacking in information. She scratched her head thoughtfully, as if trying to find an answer. She remembered the emperor's words thrown in her direction that she should not expect much from him. The girl was angry that Carl didn't even stop at the fact that he was late for the ceremony. She clenched her hand into a fist, assuming that even on their wedding day he brazenly went to see Diane Poitiers. Meanwhile, in the ivory castle, the emperor walked with long strides along the corridor. He was alarmed, and he asked the servants if Diana had woken up. They bowed their heads and denied it. The man entered the bedroom and stopped at the threshold. The blonde lay quietly on the pillow, covered with a blanket. At some point it seemed to him that it was his mother and she was calling him Carl, my son. But soon the obsession ended. The girl saw the emperor wearing wedding clothes, and she assumed that after her fainting his wedding could be disrupted. Carl asked if she was already coming to her senses, and she answered his question with a question. Did he come to her immediately after the ceremony? And she said that he shouldn't have done that. Diana looked away and asked to forgive her. After all, because of her, the emperor had continuous problems. She told her lover that today it was better for him to be close to his legal wife, which he swore an oath of fidelity to her. And she assumed that she was already tired of waiting for him. The emperor insisted that he had already told his newly made wife that he would not come, and he advised Diana to better worry about herself. The girl's hands were shaking. She was clutching the blanket. She said that she chose the empress's wedding dress, her crown, her bouquet, and jewelry. She assured that when she did all this, her heart was torn into pieces. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Stealthily looking at the man, she decided to herself that she should have stopped there. Otherwise, Carl might get tired of her constant whining. The emperor's face was stony. It did not express any emotions, and its gaze stopped at one point. The girl thought with bitterness that there was that insensitive look of his again. The man assured his concubine that nothing would change, but would remain the same. And the answer was Diana asking him how he was going to introduce her to the Empress. The girl reminded him that he now had a wife, and the aristocrats will now openly call her a mistress. The emperor was like a lone wolf that could not be tamed forever. She asked him to call her his beloved. Diana understood perfectly well that she could control the emperor like a puppet. Karl agreed to do as his concubine wanted. He said briefly, "Okay." The girl turned to His Majesty. There was a plea in her eyes. She asked Karl to hug her, holding out her hand to him. Soon the man was lying with his concubine under the same blanket, hugging her. And she thought that if she could not become his empress, she would make sure that no one got a place next to him. The morning illuminated the palace with the rays of the rising sun. The people in the palace were all just whispering. They were surprised that the emperor went to the ivory palace immediately after the wedding ceremony. And because of this, everyone gossiped that the empress had spent her wedding night completely alone. The ladies said that His Majesty was late for the wedding. And as it turned out, before that he was also in the same palace. They were worried about the poor empress. Another lady said that the newlywed forbade anyone from entering her room, but she believed that this still would not help her save her face. The third said that there was no use in the fact that she was an empress, even if she didn't reach the level of a concubine. The friend didn't tut and elbowed her to keep her quiet. The ladies saw Her Majesty the Empress. She was sad but reserved. She was accompanied at a distance by 2 maids. Recently, the ladies chattering happily together made a deep curtsy, greeting Her Majesty. When the Empress walked away, one of those ladies cautiously asked the other if their conversation could be heard. Another said that she did not know, but suggested that they should be careful in future. And our heroine, throwing open the doors, burst into her room. She hurried to sit down on the chair. Adele covered her face with her hands, trying to cope with her emotions. She asked herself what she expected. But I thought it was much tougher than I had previously imagined. The princess came here alone without taking anyone from home with her. But not only because this was Egmont's condition. It's just that none of her close associates deserved to endure exile with her. Adele told herself that she needed to come to her senses. She should have stopped thinking about the past. And she had to cope with what she had. The wedding banquet in Egmont was usually held on the 3rd day after the celebration. Diana was straightening the flowers in the flower pots. The maid asked the mistress if there was anything else that needed to be done. She answered negatively. Because of the monsters that came down from the tower, Diana lost her parents. But still, she did not receive the status of the count's daughter, and then she managed to win the love of the emperor himself. The girl believed that she achieved everything only thanks to her diligence. She thought that there was some girl here who was born under a lucky star, and having become a princess had no right to stand above herself. Diana thought that today the empress would not be able to properly enjoy her status. Wedding night, first banquet. Diana believed that she herself would be the main character of all these events. She squeezed the rose flower tightly in her hand. The girl believed that initially all this belonged only to her. The lacing on the dress did not meet on the brunette's back. She threateningly told the maids that there was no need to delay any longer. And she demanded that it be removed immediately. Aledia was sitting on the sofa and drinking tea. The servant bowed her head and asked for forgiveness. She assumed that the measurements from Gautroff did not agree with those here. The newly crowned empress asked why the wedding dress was the right size for her. The maid suggested that it was made by other craftsmen, and once again she apologized. But there was nothing to be done, and Adele ordered the maid to go and correct this situation. She said that it was okay because she could afford to be late for this banquet. The maid shifted from foot to foot and mumbled something. Adele asked what the problem was. The girls apologized, and they said that it was very difficult to adjust clothes in smaller sizes. And the girl told herself that she was constantly destroying monsters and towers, and the battle inside the palace seemed so insignificant to her. Adele never took a break from this war. She warned herself not to relax for a minute in Egmont. And I collected my thoughts. She said that in this case she had 2 options, and she clasped her hands in front of her. Adele told herself that either she would not show up to the wedding reception, or she would wear the wrong size dress. The girl asked the maids if Diana Poitiers had prepared her wedding, and she was also interested in whether the emperor himself had forgiven him. Those 2 only nodded silently in response to the empress. She thought it was funny that the concubine wanted to show her unattainability with the help of these dresses and the emperor's love. She ordered the servants to bring her wedding dress and her crown. The maid was extremely surprised, And Adelaide said that everyone underestimates her. Diana joyfully thought that the Empress would probably never appear again. She doubted that she would come here wearing the clothes that she had brought with her. And all the prepared dresses were too small for her. She said that Count Desponte helped her a lot. The man said that everything was thanks to her refined taste. And one lady told the hostess that her necklace seemed to be one of those very new items. Diana confirmed this, and she boasted that they also included earrings. The girl said sadly that she wanted to look for something for herself. But I found out that she had already bought everything, and so she had to return. By the way, the lady heard that the emperor spent his first wedding night with Diana Poitiers, and laughing she said that she envied them that they had such love. The concubine asked the lady to refrain from such statements. After all, she actually felt very sorry for the empress. The girl thought to herself that these aristocrats, who were born with a golden spoon in their mouth, were now standing and trying to somehow get closer to her. She voiced out loud that she had sent him to his wife many times. Many people complimented Diana, tried to keep eye contact with her and smile. Someone even asked her to reduce taxes due to a bad harvest, and others asked to send a couple of strikers to them. All this took the girl's breath away and excited her whole body, and her brother said that their mistress was so modest. The guy knew that by order of the emperor, all matters related to the palace were under the control of his sister, and the range of these rights was obviously much wider than that of the emperor himself. A male voice said that his remarks could be considered treason. Diana and her brother's faces fell, and the always so reserved Duke Valdor was in a hurry to join them. The blue-eyed guy asked the minister what the problem was, and he asked me to explain what he was wrong about. Diana thought that they should have stopped them. After all, a conflict between them in such a place could only worsen the situation. The Duke said that he could remind him again why they were having a banquet here. The guy gritted his teeth, and the minister continued that if he was even a little worried about himself, then he should have watched his words and actions. The Duke turned around and walked away. Brother Poitiers rushed to catch up with him. Diana tried to calm down and stop the enraged guy. But then the appearance of Her Majesty the Empress herself was announced. All eyes were directed towards her. Adelaide appeared at the banquet in her wedding dress with a crown on her head. She walked majestically with her head held high. Duke Valdor did not take his admiring gaze off the beautiful and so distant Empress. Meanwhile, the girl walked along the carpeted steps to the 2 places of honor in the hall. Diana, who expected the shame of her rival, silently clenched her teeth tightly out of anger. The aristocracy was surprised by the appearance of their ruler. Adelaide playfully told the gentleman that she was a little late for her own banquet, and the guests understood that Adelaide walked with confidence along the imperial stairs, which no one had the right to climb. Diana looked at all this, and she clearly didn't like this atmosphere. After all, the eyes of the nobility were now focused on the Empress. Adele asked Count Desponais if he was pleased with the banquet. The man expressed joy that Her Majesty had finally arrived. He insisted that he had been waiting for her all evening. The girl confidently sat down in one of the pair of chairs in a place of honor. She behaved with pride and dignity. The aristocrats did not know what to do, and they decided which of them would be the first to greet the Empress. A brunette with dark blue eyes spoke up. He turned to Her Majesty. It was Lionel Valdor. Adele recognized him immediately. The minister bowed his head, followed by the rest of the guests of this banquet. He said that he was glad to welcome her. The Empress answered with restraint that she was glad to meet, and she asked if everyone was from the Duchy of Valdor. And the aristocrats decided that this would not work, that they too should greet her personally and introduce themselves to who they were in this empire. Diana was angry that the Empress never even looked at her, and the aristocrats came in a crowd to bow to Adelaide. The concubine puffed out her lips in resentment, and since the Empress did not want to look at her, she was going to make sure that she watched only her. The noble ladies noticed the blonde. They recognized her as Madame Poitiers, and they were surprised how she could appear before the Empress in such a place. And they believed that the Emperor himself was behind her. The girl greeted Her Majesty. She introduced herself as Diane Poitiers. Adelaide politely replied that she was glad to meet them, and I thought to myself that I had decided to arrange a fun show for those present. The blonde assured that it was she who organized the wedding and this banquet, and she asked if she liked it too. The Empress said that Diane did her best. She told the girl not to be upset that she could not wear the dresses that she had prepared for her. Adelaide assured that all the dresses were simply beautiful, but to her great regret, the size did not suit her, and she said that you don't even have to apologize because everyone could make a mistake. The concubine was even more upset, She only noticed that the Empress was wearing a wedding dress. Because it didn't look like a bride's dress, she didn't even realize it right away. People nearby began to whisper that if Madame Poitiers herself prepared the clothes, then it turned out that she was deliberately harming the Empress. The girl felt judgmental glances on her. The appearance of His Majesty the Emperor was announced. The man was extremely reserved and cold. He appeared at a moment when the situation could have escalated even more. Carl walked along the carpet to the place of honor. He noticed that even today all eyes were focused on the Empress. Adelaide quietly dominated and dominated. It seemed to him that she was so cruel that even if she was pricked, not a drop of blood would flow out of her. A tear rolled from the concubine's blue eyes, and the Emperor looked angrily at his beloved. He wanted to hear her explanations. Diana looked at His Highness through the eyes of a victim. The Empress was perplexed. She was angry that her husband thought that it was she who brought the girl to tears. Carl asked his wife what she was doing now. She thought that was what she wanted to ask him. Adelaide replied that she was just saying hello. The Emperor was indignant that it was impossible to say hello, that now his beloved was crying. The brunette replied that she was also interested in why she was shedding tears here, and she suggested asking the girl about it personally. Carl turned to the concubine, now awaiting her explanation. She said that she simply wanted to greet the Empress. The man walked up the steps. He silently walked past his wife and sat down on the throne. Adele once again swallowed her resentment towards him. The musicians played the violins masterfully. Melodies flowed throughout the banquet hall, entertaining the guests. Carl coldly told his wife to stop touching her. He said that she was his beloved, so he demanded to leave her alone. He offered the condition that he would not worry about her lover, and he asked if his wife was ready to come to an agreement with him. The girl thought that she didn't know if this quality was good, but when she was angry, the first thing she did was start smiling. Adelaide replied that her husband would tell his beloved that she met her twice, and every time she came to her herself. The Emperor, turning away from his wife, sipped red wine from a glass. The minister's comrade-in-arms was amazed that the Empress did not lose her calm even at such a moment. The brunette replied that it was so, and he saw that she did not so much remain unperturbed, but rather calm herself down. Already in the evening in the palace after the end of the banquet, having taken off her elegant dress and replaced it with a more familiar one, our heroine could give free rein to her emotions. Adele was simply infuriated. She stood with her eyes closed and her hands resting on the round table. She was simply infuriated by those dresses that did not fit her, those smirks and hidden insults directed at her. The girl told herself that because of the flared emotions, her mana had increased too much. Meanwhile, in her room, the chandelier from the ceiling was swinging. Adele saw through the window that it was already dark outside. She tried to relax, watching the stars through the glass. She put her face under the shine of the stars, and I told myself that it was still too early. She needed to restrain herself. The Empress poured herself a glass of red wine, and now she drank it with pleasure in small sips. She was ready to ignore Poitiers, but she couldn't understand what was happening to Carl. Adele decided that since her husband could not live without this beloved, then why didn't he make her Empress? But instead he brought her, a princess from a distant country, and now he showed her his character. In these thoughts the bottle was already empty. The girl suggested that the Emperor might have a fetish for unhappy love. She had already gone to bed, but her thoughts still kept her from falling asleep. She thought it was crazy that he wouldn't care about her lover. Adele remembered her father's instructions. He told his daughter to present herself as if she had everything, and not to behave modestly. After all, when she has nothing left, people will immediately understand it. And now the girl realized that if it was revealed that she had become an empress only in words, and that the emperor himself did not recognize her, then she would be torn into pieces that same day. Adelaide forced herself to think and look for the optimal solution. The next morning, she decided to find out from the maids who managed the important palace affairs. The servant replied that the position was still vacant. The brunette was surprised and argued that in this case there should be a temporary replacement person. She asked if Diane Poitiers was in charge of everything. The maid said that everything was so. Adelaide asked who had done this before. The girl timidly answered that it was Hannah Giggs, the Count's wife. The Empress ordered that the Countess be called to her immediately, and tell her that she wants to meet her. She also ordered that the latest edition of the Code of Laws of the Empire be brought to her. Our heroine flipped through the pages, quickly reading them one after another. It turned out that the current emperor entrusted the management of the palace to Dion Poitiers instead of the empress. However, along with the appointment to this title, Aladida received an exclusive right. The girl closed the book and put her hand on it. She found in her what she wanted. The maid told Her Majesty that a guest had come to see her. The Empress was already ready to accept. Countess Elizabeth greeted Her Majesty. She recalled that they had already met her during the banquet. Adelaide said she was glad to see her ladyship again, and she assured that she herself also wanted to meet her. The ladies sat opposite each other at the tea table. The servants immediately set the table for them. The Empress ordered the servants to go out for a while. They obediently obeyed Her Majesty. Elizabeth thought that her brother's wife was shorter than she had imagined, but she didn't have the feeling that she was weak in any way. The Duchess literally felt with her skin that a dominant aura was hovering around the Empress. The girl radiated calm and confidence with her entire appearance. Elizabeth told Her Majesty that she liked her. She also said that she had heard that she called Hannah Giggs, and she assured that she was her nanny. Adele asked why she started talking to her about this topic. The blonde was sure that this step meant her desire to strengthen her position in the palace. Elizabeth thought it was obvious, and she agreed with the right choice to do so. But she assured me that it would be difficult. After all, Dion Poitiers had an advantage, the love of the emperor. And behind them stood Duc de Font. And all the people in the palace were their people. Adele said she had to ask something. She wondered whether the fact that she wanted to take over the management of the palace would have any effect on the Duchess. Elizabeth noted the extreme straightforwardness of the Empress, and I decided that it was worth talking to her directly and to the point. The blonde began to reveal the cards. She reported that His Majesty was under the control of Diane of Poitiers and the Duke of de Font. But because of this, he could not follow the true path of the Emperor. The Duchess insisted that this was why she wanted Adelaide to cut the strings with which Karl ran her bar, and for this, Adelaide should have taken control of the management of the palace. Elizabeth assured that her nanny would help her a lot with this. She also advised me to advertise that she was looking for an assistant. This surprised the girl quite a bit. The blonde said that the management of the palace and its internal affairs are most often handled by a woman, and it would be nice if a man became an advisor to the Empress. Adele recalled that every time her father changed concubines, her mother got herself an assistant. The brunette summed up the Duchess's words, that since the Emperor had a beloved, she should have had a lover. Elizabeth insisted that she should not do anything out of spite. After all, in the Empire it was very important not to lose face. She told the Empress that if after all those insults she did nothing, then everyone will look down on her and whisper that she is worse than any mistress. And she also said that if Duke Valdor sent her an application, then she should have agreed to his candidacy without hesitation. These words made Adele think. It was known that Hannah Giggs had a close and fruitful relationship with the previous Empress. For this reason, she was involved in palace affairs and was the nanny of the Grand Duchess. For a long time, a woman held a high position in the palace. But her usual life began to crumble with the arrival of one person. This became Diane Poitiers. This girl caused the misfortunes and death of the previous Empress. The blonde was surprisingly similar to the biological mother of Emperor Charles, and soon he fell madly in love with her, and after some time, His Highness entrusted all palace affairs to his concubine. First of all, having received power into her own hands, Diane kicked Hannah Giggs out of the palace. Then the elderly lady was fired in disgrace. She now stood before the new Empress with an extraordinary feeling of excitement. Adelaide looked with sympathy at the already middle-aged Countess, whose name had been tarnished by some girl. The woman wiped away a stingy tear. She asked for forgiveness, and she said that she had not been here for so long that tears naturally came to her eyes. The girl asked whether the palace remained the same as it was during the life of the Empress. Hannah stroked her hand along the back of the red-upholstered sofa. She insisted that she remembered the day when she chose him, but now she would think that it would be worth changing. Adelaide said that she would like to entrust this matter to her. She asked if the Countess agreed to this. The woman replied that she would gladly agree to the proposal, but it seemed to her that His Majesty would not like it. The brunette asked if the lady agreed to work for her in this palace like in the old days. Hannah Giggs replied that, as she had already said, she would accept her offer with gratitude. Then a maid came in and informed Her Majesty that the dress she had recently ordered had already arrived. Adele asked what the problem was. The servant hesitated to answer, not knowing how to tell her. The Countess came to the rescue. She asked why the girl hesitated, and she ordered me to tell her everything as it is. The maid said that there was a problem in the financial management of the palace. She was informed that they could not pay for the Empress's dress. Aledia thought it was some kind of nonsense that they couldn't afford to pay for her dress. The girl suggested a way out of their situation, as if asking the Countess for advice, to invite traders to her and personally pay them. Hannah Giggs agreed with this approach. After all, unnecessary rumors could only do harm. It was necessary to thank the merchants properly so that they would keep everything a secret. But the Countess believed that the Empress should not have met with them in person, and she offered to entrust this assignment to her. Adele ordered the servants to go and bring the merchant here. She obediently obeyed Her Majesty. The maid left to carry out the order, and the girl went to her room. Soon she took out a gold bar from the bag. She told herself that she didn't think she'd need them so soon, and since they decided to challenge her, she was ready to accept it. The Countess, partially taking out a gold bar from a linen bag, said that she would look at the quality of the dress and pay for it, and she asked permission to use the entire amount without returning the rest. She expressed the hope that Adelaide's honor would not be tarnished by this event. The girl said that this is why she brought this ingot, and it was now at the disposal of the Countess. The Empress asked the woman how she thought this could happen. Hannah said discreetly that most likely there was no budget allocated for her palace. This surprised and puzzled the girl a little. The Countess explained that in Egmont the budget for the next year was distributed at the end of the previous one, and since Adelaide had only recently arrived, her palace was probably not taken into account. The girl asked what was happening and how it was supposed to happen, but Hannah denied it. She assured that it was possible to distribute funds through an additional system. True, only His Majesty the Emperor had control over this budget. Adele began to think that she would have to meet him in person. Then the maid came in. She reported to Her Majesty that she had already brought the merchant. The Empress ordered him to be brought here. Adele turned to the Countess, and she said that she hoped for her. The woman replied that Her Majesty should not worry about anything. Hannah Giggs dared to ask where the Empress was going. The girl was determined and seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere. She answered vaguely that it was necessary to know the enemy by sight, and she asked not to worry about her. She told her to stay in her palace today. The Emperor's palace was brightly illuminated by the sun. Flags with coats of arms decorated the entrance group. The men were extremely surprised by the appearance of the Empress here. They greeted Her Majesty. Adelaide asked if the central meeting was held here. The employees confirmed this. The girl announced that she had come to ask for an audience with the Emperor. The man replied that if she waited in the living room, he would find out from the Emperor and inform her. Adelaide said, "No need." She ordered to be taken to the meeting waiting room, and she said that she would wait there. She wanted to see how the meetings were going. The man with a neat beard and mustache was dressed quite simply. He earnestly asked His Highness to send strikers to them, who could destroy the tower. He also asked for help from keepers who could protect them. He assured that people were dying right now, and flying monsters had already begun to emerge from there, and that they could not be stopped. Count de Font himself was surprised at that request for help, and he considered the man a hillbilly who was unable to correctly analyze the situation. Young Poitiers asked Count Kelvin not to exaggerate his problem. After all, he had a 4th-level tower. But the man insisted that they did not understand him, because the portal was growing rapidly. The Count of Poitiers assumed that if they sent the magicians into their territory, and at this time the tower of the 1st level will descend on the palace of the Emperor himself. And what should they do in this case? He considered requests to put the safety of the Emperor at stake as selfish. Count Kelvin was furious and called on Lennox Poitiers to answer for his words. The blue-eyed guy was also indignant. He considered himself absolutely right. His face was distorted by a grimace of rage, and our heroine listened to all this through the closed door of the Emperor's meeting room. She thought about the question that had arisen. Then Duke Valdor spoke. He addressed His Majesty, and he said that he considered it necessary to urgently send help to the possessions of Count Kelvin. He assured that the Emperor had enough people. In addition, the imperial magicians were in the palace. Young Poitiers interrupted the Minister of Defense with a shout. He said that the magicians were not fooling around in the palace. Karl shouted, "Stop!" and hit the table with his palm. He had a paper in his hands. The Emperor told Count Kelvin that he was sorry that this had happened to his land, and he assured that he would consider his request. The man was crying. He asked His Majesty to have mercy on him. It was clear that the Count was in complete despair. Carl announced that with this he declared their meeting closed. He said that all his members could be free. Someone was already getting up. Some looked at each other and exchanged short phrases. Duke Valdor was in no hurry to leave the hall, and Count Kelvin was in tears. She thought that everything was over for him and the end had come. An employee approached the Emperor and told him that Her Majesty the Empress was waiting for him. Carl was extremely surprised. The man said she was in the waiting room, and he asked where it was worth escorting her. The ruler replied that as soon as the meeting room was free, he would invite her here. As the meeting participants left, they were surprised to see the Empress waiting there. They joyfully greeted Her Majesty, bowing their heads before her. The girl realized that in the end the Emperor decided not to send magicians to help Count Kelvin, and she decided to personally meet with that man herself. But then someone called out to her, "Daughter-in-law!" The man with silver hair opened his arms, and he said that he was infinitely glad to see her here. The other aristocrats were surprised that Count de Font addressed the Empress so familiarly. Adelaide narrowed her eyes but did not answer a word of greeting. The Count realized that she was not so simple, and he began to apologize to her if his words offended her. The man assured her that, as the Emperor's eldest uncle, he wanted to show her friendliness. The brunette said that there were other ways to show it, and she asked him to be more careful in future. Count de Font made a slight bow of his head. He assured Her Majesty that she would keep this in mind from now on. At this very time, Duke Valdor approached the Empress. The brunette greeted the Empress with a restrained bow. The girl recognized Lionel Valdor. She answered with a smile that she was glad to see him, and she turned to him so that he would point her to Count Kelvin. And he was just leaving and heard the words of the Empress's address to the minister. He greeted Her Majesty with a low bow. The girl said that she heard about his statement about flying monsters on his territory. The man confirmed this. Adele asked if there were magicians who were in charge of these lands. The Count told Her Majesty that those were being distributed in the palace. At this time the young blonde man also bowed. He said that he was glad to meet, and he introduced himself as Lennox Poitiers, vice-captain of the magicians. The Empress told the guy that Count Kelvin had flying monsters, and in Egmont their tower was distributed into the middle class, and it was clear to her that the residents would not receive help. The Count of Poitiers said that the Empress had nothing to worry about. He assured that he could protect the palace, that not a single monster would penetrate here. Adele understood that the guy was only pretending to know everything. The girl realized that Lennox clearly underestimated her. The employee called out to Her Majesty. He said that His Majesty the Emperor was waiting for her. Adelaide replied that she understood everything, and she said that she was glad to meet everyone. She turned around and walked towards her husband. The aristocrats watched her go. Her cold gaze and reserved behavior showed that the girl was from the upper class. It was just like the day Duke Lionel Valdor first met her. The girl stood and looked intensely towards the Emperor. She carefully tried to hide her excitement. The Emperor was puzzled by the arrival of his wife. He didn't expect to see her here in the palace. Adele was determined not to give up and defend her interests to the end. She walked to the table to sit down, and then the question came about what business she came for. Carl stood motionless and looked sternly at Adelaide. The girl sat down. The young husband asked her what she wanted to talk to him about. The girl bowed her head. She asked why he decided to marry her. Carl was at a loss and did not understand what she meant. Adele asked why her husband decided that she was suitable for the Empress's place. She continued that it was he himself who sent her that marriage proposal. Carl thought that the girl was right and answered her something out of place. It was clear from Adelaide's gaze that she didn't understand anything yet. The Emperor touched the inkwell with the feather, and thoughtfully voiced that its existence was like these feathers. The husband took the pen in his hand and said that her presence alone would be enough. The young brunette thought that she didn't want to just be here, like these feathers on her pen. She was outraged, and she noted for herself looking at the feather that she was compared not even to a rod, but simply to a feather. Containing her anger, the girl asked if her husband wanted to tell her that she should sit and simply exist with the title of Empress. Adele cast an angry glance towards the Emperor and asked him why he was ruining her reputation. Carl hesitantly replied that he didn't do it. Adelaide went on the offensive and asked if her husband was afraid that she could harm Diane Poitiers. Carl was extremely puzzled by her questions. Taking the pleasant velvet material of the dress in her hands, Adele thought that this was actually the reason for her being here. Rising from her seat, she said that she was glad that he wanted her to take the role of Empress. After all, their thoughts agreed on this. The emperor's gaze remained calm and stern. The young girl straightened up and said assertively that she agreed to fulfill all her obligations. She also wanted him, as the Emperor of Egmont, to assist her in this. Carl asked, puzzled, what kind of help his wife expected from him. Our heroine, standing in front of the Emperor, answered that first she needed an assistant, someone with whom she could resolve issues of the empire, and it would be good to consult with the manager. But unfortunately, it turned out to be Diane Poitiers, and she said that she could not call her to confer. This motivated Adele that she would like to choose Hannah Giggs for this role. The man was surprised. The wife said that she heard that she was allegedly escorted out of the palace. She asked that Hannah be returned to her previous position. She assured that she was not going to restore her to a managerial position. The emperor agreed with this, but his wife said that she still had one thing to do with him. She said that the empress's palace was not taken into account when distributing the budget. Adele expressed the hope that her husband would use a system of additional financing. The girl, without waiting, left the emperor without saying goodbye. She slowly walked away proudly with her head raised. Her scarlet dress represented the power of Empress Egmont. Carl remembered how, as a boy, he always reached out his hand, but could never touch the hem of Her Highness's dress. And his mother always pitied him. She said that the empress would never recognize him. These memories gave the emperor a headache. He tried to somehow calm down that pulsating wave that rushed over him so sharply, replacing the picture of the memory of his childhood years. Charles wondered how the budget for the empress's palace could not be distributed. The emperor called the servants. Soon a guy appeared on the doorstep. He was ready to serve his majesty, and he ordered Diane to be called to him. The concubine was soon before the emperor. She looked at him innocently with her sky-colored eyes. The girl asked why he called her, coming closer to her lover. The emperor asked if she had brought papers related to the palace budget. Diane confirmed this. She placed the stack of papers she had brought in front of him. After quickly looking through them, the emperor asked, why were no funds allocated for the empress's palace? After all, this should have been at her coronation. The blonde made a confused expression on his face. She wondered if she could have forgotten to do this. Diane asked His Majesty to forgive her that she forgot to check this. She assured me that she thought this had already been done. A tear rolled down the blonde's cheek. Words of apology escaped her lips, but the emperor rudely barked at her to stop. The emperor said that she could still fix everything now. He ordered her to stop crying, and he held out his handkerchief. Diane assumed that the empress was very angry with her, and she asked what she should do now. She used His Majesty's handkerchief, and the emperor caught himself that the girl again reminded him of his own mother. As a child, his mother often cried and called her son in affectionate words, asking what she should do. Diane brought the emperor out of his thoughts. She smiled and asked what he wanted to talk to her about when he called her to his place, and she noted to herself that she had some kind of bad feeling. Charles coldly said that the power of the empress had been transferred to Her Highness. He said that all internal affairs that she had previously managed would now be decided by the empress herself. The carriage rolled steadily along the stones of the cobbled street. The man expressed his surprise at the recent sight. He said that Duc de Font wanted to place a puppet in the empress's place, and for this reason he found a princess from a distant empire. But he clearly did not calculate all the moves. Duke Lionel Valdor agreed. He said that with just one glance, the empress changed the entire atmosphere around her. His interlocutor said that now he understood why the empress sent her daughter to a distant country overseas. He knew that the new emperor Gottroff was only 14 years old. The man understood that if such a domineering sister was next to the young ruler, this could hinder him quite a lot. Only then did he notice that Lionel was not listening to him at all, but was flying somewhere in the clouds, deep in thought. The Duke looked detachedly out the window. He tried to understand why from the first day of their meeting that beautiful but so distant girl did not leave his head. Countess Giggs told Her Majesty that she had done an excellent job with the task. The woman placed a cup of tea in front of Adelaide. The Empress asked the woman whether she had paid for her dresses from the merchants while sipping tea. Hannah answered her in the affirmative. Adele saw that the Countess clearly did not dare to tell her something, and she directly asked what the problem was. The Countess asked whether Adelaide personally chose the dress she was now wearing. The girl shrugged. She said the maids asked if she wanted to dress him, and she agreed. Hannah said that in this case she would order a new outfit for her. Adele asked if there was anything about him that was inconsistent with the Empire. The Countess said that in it the girl looked very similar to the previous Empress. It was as if the girl was wearing the clothes of her predecessor. She believed that this could provoke the emperor. Hannah said that it was advisable not to wear such dresses at all. The girl knew that she was close to the previous empress, and later Karl kicked her out. It seemed strange to her, but in such matters she still preferred to follow her advice, and she promised that she would do so. The girl knew that she had no one else to trust. Adelaide warned that she also had to meet with Count Kelvin. Meanwhile, night descended over the ivory palace. Diane Poitiers was sitting on the bed. She buried her face in her knees and cried. The girl thought about how she was so easily deprived of power. She couldn't understand what Adelaide had done. After all, she got everything without any effort. From birth. She considered it monstrously unfair when some were given everything and others nothing. Diana was in tears of despair. She went to the window and looked at the garden in the night glow of the stars. The ivory palace was beautiful, and the emperor himself gave it to Diane. The girl was not going to refuse this gift so easily. Despite the fact that the emperor's mother had previously wanted to live in the palace, it was given to a concubine. The girl decided that she would not allow herself to be deprived of these possessions. Her face lit up. Diana firmly decided that she would regain both her lover and the palace. At this time, the emperor thought that it was necessary to allocate an additional budget. Diana at this time called Lorraine to her. She asked the maid to bring her financial documents in order to make changes to them. She wanted with all her heart to put the empress in her place and show her that she was just a dummy with a high-profile status. Count Kelvin sat on the sofa in the living room and was sad about the upcoming events that could destroy the entire empire. The empress majestically entered the hall. Her raven hair went perfectly with her purple outfit and matching jewelry. She was accompanied by the countess. She sat down on the sofa opposite and immediately asked the count when the magic tower appeared, what its diameter was and whether flying monsters appeared. Calvin's face showed horror. He feared their lack of a striker and a defensive mage. Only local residents fought with the flying creatures, but their efforts were completely in vain. It was surprising that there was not a single defensive magician and not a single warrior. And all they had was the help of magicians from the neighboring area, who were too weak for fourth-level creatures. The lack of help and even a second-level tower already indicated that they were simply left to their own devices. Count Kelvin addressed the empress with a plea. He asked to save ordinary residents. They were torn to shreds by huge teeth and claws, and the knights were exhausted and could not fight against the monsters. The countess, who appeared on the threshold, was indignant and told the count to stop scaring the young empress. Adele herself perfectly understood how superficially the count described what was happening, and how he was afraid to hurt her tender feelings with his story. A picture appeared in the empress's eyes. A little boy was bursting into tears near the body of his dead mother, torn to pieces by flying monsters. Adele understood that the tower was a chance of salvation, but the empress's mother asked her not to interfere and simply close her eyes to what was happening. In return, she promised Adele to throw the whole world at her feet. The girl answered her mother that she made decisions so easily because she had not seen with her own eyes the torment of the residents. All these were her memories of a long-standing dispute, after which her mother deprived her of hereditary rights and the title of princess. Meanwhile, the count said goodbye to the empress, apologized for the concern, and said that he was leaving for his native land. He asked Adele to evacuate all residents to a safe area. Adele ordered the residents to be taken to caves and dungeons. This primarily applied to the elderly, children, and the wounded. She advised the earl to negotiate with other counties in order to hold out longer. She argued that this could provide additional resistance to central control. Adele exchanged significant glances with Countess Giggs. The woman understood everything without words. Soon Hannah handed the linen bag into the hands of Count Kelvin. The man was extremely surprised and a little confused. But when the count looked at the contents, he was simply dumbfounded. There were gold bars there. He asked why they did this. Adele calmly but confidently said that this should have been enough to reach an agreement with the neighbors. She asked for forgiveness that she could do nothing more to help him. The minister asked his colleague his opinion on why the empress called Count Kelvin. He suggested that she might be interested in recent events. The guy admitted that he did not think that the emperor would refuse to help the count. After all, he was always so devoted to the imperial family. Duke Lionel Valdor insisted that it was ridiculous to try to understand why a ruler abandoned his subordinates in trouble. At this very time, the guy in the pince-nez saw through the window that the same Count Kelvin, about whom we were talking, had arrived. The man walked hunched over and leaned on a cane with his right hand. In his left, he had a linen bag. The minister hurried to meet the man. He held him by the shoulder, and he anxiously asked what happened to him in the Empress's palace. The Count untied the bag and handed it to the Duke. There were gold bars there. He said that the Empress ordered the evacuation of the residence. Lionel was surprised. The man expressed his sincere gratitude to the minister. He reported that now he needed to quickly return and help the inhabitants of his lands. The assistant asked the Count to wait. He asked him to take it and handed him the bag, and he apologized that they could not personally provide assistance. The man cried from the excess of emotions that washed over him. He said he was so ashamed of himself. Soon the carriage with Count Kelvin was leaving. The minister and his assistant looked after him. The guy in the pince-nez told the minister that the Empress's actions surprised him quite a bit. Lionel asked himself if she gave the gold to the Count so that he could save his inhabitants. Adele drank tea. She said that the only thing she could do was to give the Count a few bars of gold. Countess Giggs was confident that Her Majesty had done everything in her power. The girl remembered how her mother called her smart, and she assured that the world was structured in such a way that the smart created and the wise captured. Therefore, as a mother, she advised her daughter to act wisely. Adele was sad that she had to endure insults and shame, and she could only give a little money to someone who desperately needed help. And all this was due to her lack of power. The girl understood that the only way to gain power in a foreign country was to think through her actions in advance. The Countess poured tea into a cup. She suggested that Her Majesty ask for an audience with the Emperor. The woman said that since they were in Egmont, it was worth establishing contact with His Majesty. Adelaide looked thoughtful. She was thinking about how to establish a good relationship with the Emperor. Soon blush and lipstick were used. Countess Giggs assured Her Majesty that she was simply beautiful. Adelaide braided her hair. I wore a choker and earrings as a set. A strict blue dress with a frill at the neckline and a fitted silhouette emphasized girlish sophistication. The girl was wondering what wise act would make her life in Egmont easier. She thought that first she needed to improve relations with the Emperor. The Emperor sat alone in his office. The servants reported to him about Her Majesty's visit to him. He nodded silently in response. The door to the room opened. Her Majesty the Empress entered it. Carl's attention was immediately attracted by her luxurious sapphire-colored dress. The girl's black hair was combed to one side, exposing the back of her head. Golden eyes and bright red lips, perfectly white skin and graceful lines of collarbones completed the enchanting sight. Carl was lost in her beauty for a moment. The girl seemed to look completely different. She sat down opposite her husband. He asked what brought her here at such a late hour. Adele offered to share the evening meal with her if he had not already had dinner. The Emperor said that he was just about to contact her because he wanted to clarify something. He asked why she called Count Kelvin. Her confusion made him smile. Unable to restrain himself, he asked his question again. Adele found it difficult to find words. She replied that she was simply interested in what happened on his lands, and I tried to find out from Carl what he was hinting at. The Emperor confidently continued to say that Kelvin's county was dying because of monsters, but he was determined not to offer help and sent him back. The Emperor had heard that Adelaide had given the Count gold bars. Carl asked her why her wife did this. Adele was surprised that the rumors reached him so quickly. She was speechless with embarrassment, and the Emperor at that time continued to scold her. He accused her of wanting to play a good role alone, and he emphasized that the Empress had a more generous heart, unlike the Emperor. The girl hastily answered His Majesty that she had called the Count to find out how things were on his territory, and gave him a small amount of money so that he would evacuate all the inhabitants there. There was a tense atmosphere in the room. The Empress remembered her mother's advice to focus on the good and shut out the negative. The Emperor's red lips curved into a grin, and she could not look away. He stood up and approached the girl. His golden eyes never left hers. She stated that it was a humane act that she could not help but do. The Emperor smilingly replied that from her words it appeared that he was not a man. Adele opened her mouth but quickly closed her eyes. The heat rose, my heart began to beat wildly. She knew it couldn't go on like this anymore. Opening her eyes in surprise, she saw that the Emperor lightly grabbed her black hair braided to one side. He ran his fingertips through her hair. He looked tenderly at her sunken collarbone. It seemed as thin as his fingers. He wondered how durable it was. The Emperor impulsively tilted his head and their shoulders almost collided. The Emperor's jaw trembled and he clenched his teeth. Pressing his nose against her collarbone, he inhaled deeply, enjoying her sweet scent. Carl asked himself if she was the same woman who captivated the crowd with her gaze. He looked at her beautiful face, and was surprised to see a fierce look, full of anger. The emperor, smiling, asked if she had come to him today in such an image not in order to seduce him and spend their first night together. He asked his wife for permission to hug her. He already wanted to kiss his wife and asked her to close her eyes. But Adele refused to do this. She demanded that he stop, proudly bearing the emperor's gaze. The empress tried to push away His Majesty's hand. He quickly reacted by grabbing her wrist. He began to say that she was once the crown princess of Gotrov. He said that her eyes perfectly matched the imperial status. Karl sternly raised his voice, telling his wife not to forget that he was the emperor here. And he added that he liked pliable and innocent girls more. He asked the girl not to interfere in his affairs anymore. Karl quickly returned to his seat. In a cold and formal tone, he said that she could go. Adele's legs and arms trembled with weakness due to humiliation. They withstood a catastrophic avalanche from the sky that hit her like a tsunami. The girl was burning with anger. She quickly left the room and walked along the endless corridor, holding onto the walls from the strong dizziness that suddenly surged over her from the emotions she had experienced. Adele was lost in thought. She suddenly stopped at the sound of a voice. It turned out that it belonged to Diane Poitiers, the person Adele would least like to date right now. Concerned, Diana approached Adele. With a caring tone, she asked what happened. The empress was shaking not only her hands but her whole body. Quietly but clearly, she ordered Diana to move away. The emperor's concubine approached Adelaide. With a hint of gloating, she whispered that it seemed that something had gone wrong with the empress, and she wondered why she ran away. Diana pointed out to Adele that she was very pale, and she advised me to wear less makeup for this. The sparkling eyes of the servants and maids mercilessly studied the two. Adele watched as the girl floated away. Suddenly, the empress ran towards the stairs. The maids were shocked. At one point, the girl stumbled. She leaned forward, beginning to fall. Adele clenched her teeth and involuntarily closed her eyes tightly. Suddenly, she felt a solid force catch her. A wave of misunderstanding passed through the girl. Strong hands gently held her shoulders. A pleasant wave of relief fell over the girl. A low, soothing voice whispered soothing words into Adele's ear. She looked at the man blankly, and then she quietly muttered his name. It was Lionel Valdor. They looked into each other's eyes for a moment. Lionel could not look away, as if he had been petrified. He wondered what could make the empress look so exhausted. He looked at her pale and frightened face. The girl's slender, neat shoulders tensed. The empress thanked the gentleman for saving her. Her gaze was downcast. Pressing her hand awkwardly to her chest, she walked away. The man remembered their first meeting. Then Adelaide's smile shone so brightly, as if the sun had awakened in her heart, illuminating everything around with the warm light of joy and hope. Lionel looked down at his hands. They seemed to be on fire. He then slowly picked them up and stared at the place where the empress had disappeared. It was as if he was working with hot metal with his bare hands. Adele returned to her chambers. Mrs. Giggs was extremely surprised. She asked why the empress returned so quickly, but she ignored her question. The girl needed to relax. She ran a hot bath. While removing makeup from her face and washing her body, Adele thought about something. Closing her eyes, she imagined her old nanny. Her wrinkled eyes were curved like the moon. Very often, Adele did not know what to do. Then she clung to her nanny for comfort. She told her to do whatever she saw fit. Whatever the result, it will serve as an experience. This is exactly what Princess Adelaide's path should be. Only people like her can change the world. She was determined that she needed to expand her own power, independent of the emperor's power. Adele took a deep breath. Having come to this conclusion, her anxious heart began to calm down. The girl remembered the stories of her mother's favorite fortune-teller. She assured them that Princess Adelaide had an eternal companion. This is luck. Adele clicked her tongue and shook her head. She muttered bitterly that that woman was just a pathetic charlatan. The empress woke up at dawn, washed her face, and started eating breakfast with an enviable appetite. It consisted of a well-done steak, 2 donuts with cheese, and a glass of red wine. Mrs. Giggs was still worried about the empress. One of the maids told her everything. That after a conversation with Karl, Adele immediately ran into Diane Poitiers, who in the end disgraced her. Then she slipped on the stairs and was caught by Lionel Valdor. The woman sighed heavily. She carefully told the empress to eat slowly. She nodded but continued to eat without stopping. There was a knock in the room. The clerk entered, bowed politely, and took out an envelope. He explained that additional budget had been allocated. and he was sent for inspection. Adele had just finished her meal. Mrs. Giggs quickly took the envelope from the clerk and handed it to Madame. She carefully took it and began to read. All eyes in the room were focused on the impassive face of the Empress. Despite the fact that her eyes slid from top to bottom once, her doll-like expression remained unchanged. Adele asked the servant where this document came from. He hastily replied that this document was sent from the Ivory Palace. She almost choked, but she managed to keep a calm face. It turned out that additional funds were allocated to the Empress by the Emperor's mistress. Adelaide ordered the servant to wait outside. He obediently went out to Her Majesty, leaving the ladies alone. The girl asked Mrs. Giggs if she had the authority to review the details of the general budget of the Imperial Palace. She answered her in the affirmative and went to get the papers. Mrs. Giggs returned with a small stack of books. Adele studied the total budget with a cold, calculating gaze. The Countess asked what confused the girl. She invited her to look at it herself. The number on the paper shocked her. The emergency additional budget amounted to no more than what was required to purchase one old horse. If the Empress was right, then the funds allocated for the Ivory Palace should belong to her palace. Hannah agreed that the budget was much higher than normal. Diane Poitiers nodded her head in confusion, as if she had foreseen the current situation. She clarified that she had to once again reconsider the decision to finance the Empress's palace. The blonde began to correct something on that paper. Quite a bit of time passed. Diane handed the letter to the clerk. The man stood with his mouth wide open. He was clearly surprised that she managed it so quickly. The girl looked displeasedly at the confused messenger. She said that she wouldn't spend the whole day doing such trifles, and she ordered the letter to be taken right away. As expected, the Empress was unhappy with the quick return. Diane Poitiers still controls the supplementary budget. Adele ruthlessly tore the document in two. In a serious tone, she ordered the employee to go to Diana again. Returning, the poor servant, who had been thrown back and forth, ran up to the princess and bowed his head. Diana said with a grin that it seemed the Empress wanted luxury. Diana asked the maid standing next to her if she had not given the Empress enough money. She agreed unconditionally. She allowed the servant to go, and he hastily left the room. The girl ordered the maid to bring her most modest dress. She also told Lorraine to convey a message to the Emperor that the Empress had summoned Diane Poitiers to see her on the issue of an additional budget. But she was trembling with fear and did not know what to do. Diana took a deep breath and muttered that it was time to catch the dark-haired animals. Adele fluently read the code of laws of the Imperial Palace. At one point, she let out a short cry of triumph and clenched her fists enthusiastically. Reading it carefully, she pointed her finger at a certain passage. The Empress has the exclusive right to decide on the acquisition of the palace residence. The Emperor has the exclusive right to distribute additional funds. Adele said that this law was created just for her case. Mrs. Giggs nodded, thoughtful. The Countess was worried about her mistress. She advised her to be careful. These laws are like a double-edged sword. If you started swinging them, you could only harm yourself. Adele was not happy that she, the Empress, was sitting and begging for money from the Emperor's mistress. And it turned out that she took pity and added another silver bar to the budget. The girl believed that her husband was the first to swing this sword. But Adele has hurt herself too many times. The Duchess did not dare to object to her mistress. Her Majesty asked Mrs. Giggs the question of how to correct a matter that had already been completed. She told her that she needed to return the documents and reissue the order. Adele smiled. Her golden eyes shone like the moon. She turned to her advisor and ordered her to obtain permission to reside in the palace of Diane Poitiers. Our heroine was sitting in the office. She reasoned. It turned out that the source of the Empress's power was complex and multifaceted. As a rule, power was acquired through family connections and the birth of an heir. Adele thought about family connections, relatives. She remembered her own mother who kicked her out of the house. The girl shook her head with a sigh, crossing out the first point. The second paragraph talked about the birth of an heir. Memories of her recent courtship flashed through her mind. She shook her head furiously. This left the option of relying on advisors and creating an independent government. Ink from the pen dripped onto the paper. A feeling came over Adele. She looked out the window. At that moment, the girl realized that it was definitely the energy of the tower. A maid came to Her Majesty with a report that Madame Poitiers had asked for an audience with her. It turned out that that beast herself decided to come. Adele ordered the guest to be led into the living room. After some time, the blonde stood in front of the Empress with her eyes downcast. She quietly greeted Her Majesty. The Empress asked if she had brought what she requested from her through the servants. The guest confirmed this, and she assured that she did not understand why Her Majesty was so dissatisfied. Countess Giggs placed the Book of Laws on the table in front of the ladies. Adelaide said she was unhappy with the budget allocated for the Ivory Palace. Diane, holding the Code of Laws of the Imperial Palace in her hands, thought her rival began to use her title and was now putting pressure on her. She replied that she did not understand why they showed it to her. The concubine thought that it would be quite difficult for the Empress without the love of the king and relatives nearby who could stand up for her. Adele voiced that she had one question for her about the lack of a report on her expenses. The girl said that all other institutions had a history of using allocated funds, and only the budget of the Ivory Palace shows only the amount allocated and spent. While Diana sighed, Adelaide leaned back deeply and took a sip from her teacup. She asked if Diane knew the reason for such a mistake, but she asked why the Empress was asking about the budget of the Ivory Palace. At the concubine's question, Adele tilted her head with a sincere smile on her face. She informed Diana that that amount would be transferred to the Empress's palace. While looking through his papers, the Emperor noticed that a maid of honor had entered the room. He knew it usually boded bad news when Diana sent one of her maids. The maid reported that the mistress had been summoned to the palace, and that she sent documents about an additional budget, but Her Majesty rejected it twice. Carl's face frowned in confusion. The girl said that in the end, Diane went to the Empress's palace to discuss everything, and that she was so frightened that the maid could not stand it and came to the Emperor for help. The Emperor felt a wave of anxiety wash over him at the mention of Diana's fear. Memories of the past echoed in his head. A distant voice asked him whether Charles would recognize her as his mother if he became emperor. Carl felt a lump in his throat. Not believing her ears, Diane Poitiers decided to clarify something. Is Adelaide really going to seize the funds of her palace and appropriate them for herself? She nodded confidently in response. Adele began to explain everything that before this, the concubine was involved in the affairs of the Empress, and of course she received her budget. But now Adele was already in the position of Empress. Therefore she believed that she should take care of her responsibilities herself, and she reported that from now on, funding will be directed to her palace. Diana remained silent. Adele leaned towards her, her golden eyes shining. She asked if the princess agreed with this. Adelaide admitted that she had done a lot of painstaking work. Therefore, she will not force her to write an expense report. Diane Poitiers should only redirect the budget of the Elephant Palace to the palace of the Empress. The blonde was surprised how the Empress, even without family or allies, could have the power to command. Diane could not refuse to carry out the order. She was in no position to contradict her. Her whole body was seething with anger. Diana was overcome with melancholy when she thought of the palace, the drawing room, and the high chair that belonged to her. Tears of rage flowed from her eyes. Adelaide heard a familiar voice in her head. He ordered her to resign as successor, renouncing her inheritance. The Empress clenched her fists tightly and took a deep breath. The expression on the face of the concubine sitting opposite her reminded her of those days when, because of one word, Adele lost her position. The Empress cleared her throat, straightened up, and addressed her in a strong voice. She claimed that she was the Empress of Egmont, that Diana shouldn't even try to take away her power. She said that Diane should not think that Adelaide deprived her of something. After all, initially it did not belong to her at all. She promised that if she stopped claiming everything, she would not take everything away from her. Diana was still shaking with anger. She cried and thought about what she had heard. She mumbled, asking where His Majesty was and why he wasn't here with her yet. Just at that moment, the door suddenly swung open without warning. Adele frowned and stared at the door. Who dared open her living room door without permission? The Emperor entered the room with long strides. His appearance was gloomy. He angrily asked what was going on here. Diana suddenly fell to her knees in front of the Empress. She screamed in a voice that mixed pain and despair with tears. It was sudden and at the same time. Adele was embarrassed and involuntarily opened her mouth, widening her eyes. Charles's gaze was focused on Diana, who was lying on the floor and apologizing to the Empress. Tousled blonde hair, a small slender back, and a trembling tone. Carl slowly raised his eyes and looked at Adele sitting in her chair. He sternly asked what was happening here. There was even a flash of madness on his face. Adelaide stood up from her chair and ordered Diana to stand. She continued to cry and ask for forgiveness without stopping. The atmosphere in the room was tense and fragile. like thin ice that could crack at any moment. Lorraine hurriedly picked up Diana, who was lying on the floor crying. Her pale face was streaked with tears, and her eyes were swollen and red. Carl gritted his teeth and ordered the maid to take the tear-stained girl to the ivory palace. The maid of honor supported Diana, who was staggering as if about to faint. Leaving the living room, they closed the doors behind them and left. Carl asked everyone to leave the room. He wanted to talk to the Empress alone, but Mrs. Giggs was still in the room. After that, the Emperor turned to Countess Giggs and said that he had not seen her for a long time. The woman bowed her head. She said that she was glad to see His Highness again. The Emperor noticed that Hannah had not changed at all during this time. He said that she again stood next to the Empress and watched how weak people were destroyed. The Countess asked if this amused him. The woman was alarmed. She looked at the monarch in a stupor. The Empress is observing the situation. She ordered Hannah to go outside and wait for her. Having not heard an answer to his question, Carl began to shout at his subject, repeating his question. The Empress also raised her voice. She ordered the Countess to wait for her outside. Hannah bowed anxiously, and she quickly went out the door. The Emperor turned to his wife in bewilderment and anger at what she was doing. The woman asked what he was doing, surprised that he liked to watch a weak person ask for forgiveness. Charles claims that the Empress has very bad interests. The girl angrily denies this. The husband assured her that he was a personal witness and did not want to hear excuses from her. With a sly and at the same time evil look, the woman suggests that the reason for her husband's behavior was precisely Diane Poitiers. She convinced that as soon as the door opened, she immediately knelt in front of her. A grin appeared on Carl's face, but still his face remained serious. He asked what kind of coincidence this was. Raising his hand to the book, he asked if the Empress was jealous of his concubine. Taking the book, the man cast an angry glance at his wife. He asked if she wanted to get what belonged to his beloved. Adele replied in a no less calm state that if you think about it, it is not she who is invading personal boundaries, but His Majesty. And she asked if he had seen the budget allocated to this palace. Turning to the side to take something from the chest of drawers, she added that he definitely didn't see it, because it was simply hidden from him. Showing a piece of paper to Carl, the girl tells the Emperor to look. She wondered whether the Empress's palace could be managed on such a small budget. Taking the paper in his hands, the man silently examines it. Turning sharply to the Empress, he asked her if that was why she had called Diane to her place. In justification, Aladaida said that she wanted Dion to convey this, and she herself came here. Without looking away, the man concluded that it was she who called her. Hearing these words, a grin appeared on the Empress's face, to which Carl said that her mother, Empress Gottroff, lied to him. He said her mother insisted that her daughter Adelaide was obedient and devoted. But he was surprised that even after being expelled from her own country, she did not understand anything. Looking sideways, the girl assured that it would be better for her husband not to raise this topic, especially if he didn't know the reason why she had to leave Gottroff. Roughly grabbing the Empress by the shoulder, Carl ordered his wife to listen to him carefully. Looking closely into her eyes, something indescribable happens between them. Continuing his speech, he said that, like feathers on a pen, like flowers in a vase, it was worth her to live at his command. The girl also looked straight into the man's eyes without saying anything, but a sudden, inexplicable feeling seemed to hit her. This almost made her faint. Empress Adelaide looked to the side with a serious look, while her husband looked at her with an expression of seriousness and at the same time an excited look. The girl jerked free from her husband's arms. She headed towards the balcony. Rubbing her eyes, she stared at the sky, which had turned red. The Empress's subordinates looked with fear at the bloody sky, while the sky was covered with lightning. Someone from the crowd began to shout that there was a tower that was descending from the sky, frightening with its appearance. Watching this from the balcony, the woman remembers her husband's words. Words about how to live are like feathers on a pen, like flowers in a vase. She seems to be wondering how at such moments one can live like this. Immediately, Hannah burst into the Empress's room looking excited. She screamed, asking if the Empress was okay. Shouting out that it was a portal coming down, she worried that they needed to hide. Empress Adelaide, in turn, turned her head to the Countess. With complete seriousness and self-confidence, she refuses her offer to hide. Standing her ground, she adds that she will not leave. At that time, the Empire's subordinates began to scurry around in panic. With fear and screaming, everyone ran away like little ants, hiding wherever they could. People saw the portal getting closer and closer. and screams were heard in the crowd that monsters were about to attack the palace, and at that time miracles were happening in the sky. Looking up, Knight Jakal assumed that the tower that descends from the sky could be the 4th level, or even the 5th. In response, the Minister of Defense said that it was good that she was heading to the garden. He explained to his comrade that it would be difficult to stop the invasion if the tower affected the structures. Lionel quickly turned to his soldiers, ordering everyone to take their place and prepare for battle. The man immediately explained to the soldiers how they should act, that their main mission after the portal touches the ground and monsters emerge from it is to stop them until the magicians appear. Addressing the knight, the Minister of Defense impatiently and seriously asked him when the magicians would arrive, to which the man replies that he doesn't know this yet. And then the commander began to have bad thoughts. He assumed that the magicians would appear when all the knights had already died. He ordered the knight to immediately go to the residence of the magicians and bring them here urgently. Lennox Poitier, vice captain of the Order of Magicians, was a first-class attacking magician of the 1st level in the Egmont Empire. It was not for nothing that he received the title of Count, despite his low origins. The magician treated what was happening with dispassion. Looking at himself in the mirror and putting a luxurious cloak on his luxurious outfit, he seems to mockingly ask if he is being asked to appear right now. The man, looking at the magician with a hint of contempt, replies that this is an order from the Minister of Defense, and that all magicians must arrive at the Rose Garden, where the tower descends. Concentrated on fastening the buttons of his beautiful cloak, the magician of Poitiers replied that now it was problematic. He added that the order belonged to the emperor, not the minister. With complete indifference to what was happening around him, Lennox complained to the knight about a button that was not fastened correctly, to which he chose to remain silent. Turning his gaze to the man, a malicious smile filled the magician's face. He asked Jakal as if claiming that they said that this time his salary was delayed. Continuing his ridicule, Poitiers said that the knight was the 2nd son of Count Jakal, and it must be difficult to be a subordinate of a knight. He offers to give one of his buttons. He said that it was made of gold, and that it could be sold for a decent amount. At this time he stroked his golden buttons on his cloak with his fingers. The knight suggested that, instead of the magician talking nonsense, he began to prepare. There is tension in his tone. It is clear that now he is thinking about the people and how to protect them, to which the magician said that it was better not to talk to him in such a tone. And he added that they also need his help. He assured that the longer he delayed, the more losses the knights would suffer. Unable to bear it, Jakal screamed. He explained that misfortune had befallen the palace and blamed Poitiers for leaving the magicians safe, and he added that everyone would have to be responsible for this. The magician put himself above others. He replied that even if others were reprimanded, he would still not be one of them. Placing his hand on the shoulder of his interlocutor, he ordered him to stop getting on his nerves, and he assured that he could appear after all these little bugs died. After the words were spoken, the magician passed by, feeling angry that his comrades could die, and the magician would not care. Jakal made a decision. He turned to Poitiers. Bowing his head, the knight began to ask for help from the magicians. At the same time, disgust for all this was visible on his face. From the words spoken, the magician began to gloat in his thoughts. He enjoyed being begged for. And I thought that this piece of hell that came down from heaven was a gift from God. At this time, the commander ordered to beware of the wreckage. He warned to be careful so that the knights would not be carried away by the updraft. Feeling the complexity of the situation, he asked his comrade if the magicians had arrived, to which I received the answer that they weren't there yet. He was again overwhelmed by the thought that this time they would not arrive on time again. He needed to protect all the warriors. A female voice asked why he was just watching what was happening. Turning around, the Minister of Defense was overcome with surprise and alarm. He saw Her Majesty the Empress in front of him. Lionel asked Her Majesty what she was doing here without an escort, and he insisted that she needed to quickly hide. The commander ordered Knight Rapard to escort Her Majesty to a safe place. Adelaide held his forearm. She asked where their magicians were. She said that the tower was almost gone down and it had to be destroyed urgently. The girl was furious. She couldn't understand why everyone was waiting for that tower to touch the ground. Lionel hurried the Empress. He said that they needed to quickly take refuge somewhere. At that time, a fragment was flying towards them. The commander covered the Empress with himself, and he said that it was dangerous here, so she should have stood behind him. But after that, his surprise knew no bounds. That fragment hovered in the air, surrounded by radiance. He realized with surprise that it was magic. Lionel thought that his knights had finally received reinforcements from the magicians. But then he saw a group of magicians in the distance. They had just arrived and were not even in a hurry. The minister was surprised. He wondered, since the magicians were so far away, who had just used magic. The Empress said that it was a level 4 tower, but she believed that she was not as dangerous as she seemed. And I was worried that help would not arrive in a timely manner. She clenched her fists resolutely. Drawing her dark steel war sword, the Empress began her run. Lionel clenched his teeth tightly. He shouted after the Empress, asking what she was going to do. The girl, as she walked without turning around, shouted to the minister that she was going to destroy this tower. He tried to stop her, assuring her that she shouldn't have done this. But Adele did not pay attention to the screams. She was already dangerously close to the field of magical action of that tower. Bloody lightning rained down around her. The captain was still trying to shout to Her Majesty. He said that she was not allowed to go there, and he was afraid that she could be carried away by the updraft. Lionel reached out his hand to grab the girl and stop her from doing her crazy thing. But his hand was pushed away by an unknown and invisible force. Later he realized that it was magic. A transparent but impenetrable shield surrounded the Empress. She stopped and looked back at the minister. She asked me to worry about her and not to interfere. The girl raised her hand with the sword. Lightning rained down around her in a continuous stream. Lionel still tried to dissuade her that she shouldn't have done this. But Adele was already in a controlled flight. In front of all the residents, the girl was approaching the magic tower. The knights were frightened and at the same time surprised by the act of their Empress. They asked in horror what she was going to do. The captain angrily barked at the rogues to gather and pull themselves together. He ordered them to keep their eyes open and not miss the moment when Her Majesty would fall. Lennox watched from a distance. He thought that the Empress had been carried away by the flood, and he gave the order to make a protective barrier around the tower. The guy wanted the magic to completely surround the territory, so that Her Majesty would not be harmed during the fall. 4 knights and a captain stood right under the tower and closely watched what was happening in the sky. It seemed that the tower began to burn. The young vice mage of Poitiers asked himself what it was. Lionel and his knights also opened their mouths in surprise. They had never seen such a reaction before. The capital commanded his knights to prevent the flames from engulfing everything around here. The guys were already running to carry out the captain's order, and he was somewhat thoughtful. He realized that Her Majesty's special suit, the sword attached to her back, it was all strong magic that did not allow him to stop the Empress. Lionel remembered how confidently the girl had recently talked about the coolness of the tower. Based on all this, he made a shocking conclusion for himself. The captain saw Adelaide fall from a height onto her back. This brought him out of his thoughts. The girl thought that no matter how much she looked at the receding sky after the destruction of the tower, it always excited her. Men were always trying to stop her, due to the danger of the procedure associated with magic, and they scared her with death. But the girl considered it her hobby, although she was reproached for such a hobby. It was time for Adelaide to land. She was now flying face down, turning around as she flew. But here the girl's surprise knew no bounds. She saw. Below on the ground, Lionel Valdor tried to catch her with outstretched arms. The Empress was surrounded by a magical radiance, which she generated with her own magical power. The knights stood with their mouths open in surprise. Adele touched her foot to the ground. She didn't need outside help for this. The girl asked in surprise if Lionel really wanted to help her. He briefly confirmed this. The Empress recalled that he was a knight with a sword, and she assumed that he could lose his hands for this. There were many in her life who scolded Adele for using magic, but so far she has not met a person who would try to catch her. Therefore, the girl thanked the captain for his help. She also expressed gratitude to him for yesterday. The Empress walked past the Minister of Defense of the Empire, pleased with herself, and he wondered how she could still smile after this. After all, I remembered how gloomy she was yesterday. Adelaide, meanwhile, had already approached the vice mage of the Empire, Lennox Poitiers. The guy looked confused and ashamed. The Empress informed him that he could already sheath his sword, assuring that he would no longer need weapons, and she headed towards the entrance to the castle. Lennox cursed under his breath. And the knight next to the magician still could not believe what he saw, that the girl alone destroyed the tower. It was a revelation to everyone that their Empress turned out to be a powerful magician. Countess Gig saw through the window that everything was in order and that the tower was destroyed. But then the woman heard footsteps and turned around at their sound. Her Majesty stood before Hannah. The girl looked a little guilty. The Countess asked why she was like that, and she assured that she was very worried about her. Adelaide said briefly and quietly, as if to herself, that she had dealt with the tower. Countess Giggs couldn't believe her ears. The girl leaned forward and fell unconscious on the floor. Hannah rushed to Her Majesty's aid. One lady was surprised that Her Majesty turned out to be a magician. Another said that according to rumors, the Empress flew into the sky and independently dealt with the portal before it touched the ground. The guy who approached them was sure that the captain of the magic squad, Duke Despont, would obviously try to lure Adelaide. After all, if she was capable of such a thing, then she was much stronger than Lennox Poitiers. There was one thing they didn't understand. Why did Gautroff send his princess to Egmont if she was such a high-level magician? Lionel Valdor stood and looked at the sky. The past minutes seemed like a dream to him. He recalled how professionally and clearly the Empress dealt with a difficult situation. He looked at his hand, trying to stop Her Majesty from what he thought was an insane act. It seemed that the skin was burning as if from a burn. The captain thought that the Empress's magic was much stronger than the disaster that descended from the heavens. He suddenly remembered how easily the girl levitated, descending back to the ground. Meanwhile, the Duke of Despot had a conversation with Lennox of Poitiers. He was surprised that the Empress turned out to be a magician of such power that she overcame the tower herself without any help. The man concluded that Her Majesty was so simple. It turned out that the princess from a distant country, who was thrown out of her home, turned out to be a magician. The guy stood looking guilty, and the Duke said that the girl turned out to be more amazing than he thought. This infuriated Lennox. He believed that he could easily cope with a tower of this level, and he believed that he should have appeared after those arrogant knights realized their insignificance. But it turned out that the Empress ruined everything for him. The guy went with his sister. He opened the door without knocking and called her name. The girl reproached her brother for not having taught him to knock in such cases. Diane was sitting at a round table. Her brother asked her if she was pregnant yet. The blonde gritted her teeth. She got angry and asked him to stop. She assured that this did not depend only on her. The guy hovered over his sister. He asked what she would do now. Diane didn't understand what was being said. Lennox said that the Empress turned out to be a magician, also an attacker and a fairly strong striker. He swore. For the blonde, it was also surprising. Diane assumed that the Empress was the one who destroyed the tower. My brother confirmed this. The girl closed her eyes. She thought that she had previously prayed so much that some puppet would take the place of the Empress. She was already a difficult character, but she also turned out to be a magician. The guy reported that according to Duke Despont, the Empress was excellent, and he was afraid that he would no longer be in demand as a magician. The girl calmed her brother down. She said that the Duke was such that he would not have taken Lennox in the first place if he had been so useless. Diane assured that her brother should not have worried because the Empress turned out to be a magician. He looked completely confused. The blonde said that he was still the strongest striker in this empire. She advised him to pull himself together and stop whining, and she promised to take good care of the Empress herself. She assured her brother that nothing would change. She asked him not to worry in vain. She was sure that the Empress alone would not do anything. Diane reminded her brother of what she and he had been through, and she was sure that such a trifle could not shake their position. She reminded him that he who laughs last laughs best, and in the castle the Empress was under the care of Countess Giggs. The woman described the fact that Adelaide decided to deal with the tower alone in one word: recklessness. And now, just yesterday, a blooming and healthy girl lay pale on the bed and has not regained consciousness since then. When the tower disappeared, the surging mana, disappearing, led the girl to severe exhaustion. Countess Hannah could not believe that the Empress single-handedly destroyed the magic tower. She heard this news from the maids who whispered merrily in the corridors of the castle. The girls said that the royal knights were greatly inspired by this event, that she appeared at such a time. The woman handed the letter in an envelope to someone she could. She told him to give it to the Grand Duchess. The Emperor stood motionless at the window. He watched what was happening with a gloomy face. Karl saw his people running in panic, trying to save their lives. The servant told His Majesty that he needed to hide, because the tower was descending to the ground. The monarch ordered him not to panic. He thought that destroying a tower of this level would not be difficult, and he was going to order them to sort this out as quickly as possible. The man saw through the window how the tower began to burn, and I thought that it was the work of a squad of magicians. The emperor realized that he was mistaken, but I couldn't figure out who did it. It turned out that Her Majesty the Empress herself destroyed the magic tower. The monarch thought sadly that the only true information that Gotroff had sent him about their princess was her gender and name. He suggested that Empress Gotroffa was not confident that she could have influence over her daughter. And that's why I sent her here. Karl ordered his assistant to go to Gotroff and there find out the whole truth about his wife in detail. Countess Giggs came to see her mistress in the morning. She saw that Her Majesty had already woken up and wished her good morning. The girl was fresh and cheerful, and Hannah saw that everything was all right with her after her recent fainting spell. Adele asked the woman to submit an advertisement on her behalf seeking an assistant for the Empress. She said it had to be an unmarried man over 20 years of age, and if the candidate had a fiancé, he will be excluded. And she said that she would make a choice after the interview. The Empress said that the choice of a candidate would depend only on her personal desires. The announcement that the Empress made spread across the entire empire, and the Duchy of Valdor was no exception. The guy read the ad and was surprised that there were so few conditions and everything was so simple. Another thought it was better than pouring water on such messages. He tried to understand what the Empress wanted to achieve, and he assumed that she could be preparing a rebellion or wanting to strengthen her power. A guy with glasses asked Lionel, who was quietly sitting in a chair, his opinion on this matter. The Duke at this time was not listening to the conversation, but was immersed in his thoughts. His friend shouted out of his reverie. Valdor replied that he did not know, and he assumed that the Empress could be planning to do both at the same time with this action. The blonde cheerfully suggested that the Empress might just have wanted to have some fun, and since she announced the search for an assistant, they could not stay away. The guy asked who would be entrusted with this matter. The blonde assured that it would be someone who was on close terms with the Valdor family. After all, it was necessary to restrain the power of the emperor using the duties of an assistant, and whoever it was, he should have been prepared for rumors about a love affair with the Empress. Therefore, until now, assistants to empresses were the second or third sons of families. Lionel reminded his brother that Her Majesty gave gold bars to Count Kelvin, and he assumed that these were the emperor's worries. He said that the Empress's views on the towers were different from the views of a squad of magicians on them. The brother asked what Lionel wanted to tell them. The eldest of the brothers, Valdor, firmly announced that he would become an advisor to the Empress. The guy with glasses asked him to change his mind. He answered Michael that they had no one to send, and he said that they simply had no other choice. The blonde scratched his cheek in thought. He said that the third son of the Verdi family was close to them, but he was not yet 20 years old. The brother tried to dissuade Lionel, and he said that he would be of no use there. After all, as soon as he becomes her assistant, they will immediately start talking behind his back about their love affair with the Empress. He replied that his reputation was already quite low in society, and he believed that they had nowhere to retreat. And given recent events, Lennox Poitiers would not want to cooperate with them. He said that he couldn't even complain about the mage squad despite that he was the Empire's Minister of Defense. His brother listened silently. Lionel continued his thought to the brothers, that they knew little about magicians, towers, and monsters, and this was Egmont's weakest point. The Duke said that at least the Empress understood more about this than they did. He assured that if he became her advisor, he would find out about it, and then they can move forward. His brother took the cup and sipped from it thoughtfully. He said that Valdor should become an assistant. Their mother, if she were alive, she would not just leave it like that. Lionel smiled and said that he would take this as his consent, and he understood that he was taking a difficult and dangerous path. The blonde, raising a significant finger up by the way, wanted to remind the brothers. What if the Empress does not choose them as assistants? And he could not understand where such confidence came from. Emperor Charles was sitting at the desk of his office. Diane was sitting not far from her lover. She thought that he never spoke to her. She sees him for the first time after that incident in the Empress's palace. His Majesty told the concubine that if she was unwell, then she could rest at home and not be here. The girl looked up at her lover with her huge blue eyes, and she asked if he had heard the latest news. Diane said that less than a month had passed since their wedding, and she was already looking for an assistant. She said that she was worried whether it would harm His Majesty. Karl coldly answered his concubine that she should not worry about this. The girl was surprised by his answer, but meeting his cold gaze, she replied that she understood everything, and asked his permission to leave. The emperor, without looking up from his business papers, immediately ordered her to take care of the additional budget for the Empress's palace, so that no more problems would arise on this topic. The girl walked and thought to herself that Karl Ulrich was her happiness and sorrow at the same time. Tears welled up in her eyes. He was the one who could turn her life into heaven and hell overnight without much difficulty. When the emperor was left alone, he called a servant to him. He ordered him to report on the Empress's announcement. The servant reported that 16 people had responded so far, and he began to list the candidates. Karl was surprised that only in the morning the announcement was made, and all the sons of prominent families attacked like bees on a hive. The emperor asked if there was anyone from the Duchy of Valdor. The servant answered negatively, and he promised that when news appeared, he would urgently inform His Majesty. Karl expected that it was unlikely that the Valdor family would personally interfere in this matter, and he assumed that they would send one of their confidants. Countess Giggs cleared her throat and said that this was the end of her report on the key political figures of Egmont. Adele admitted that she was not surprised by the previous empress's favorable attitude towards Hannah. The countess modestly thanked her for the praise. The empress held the list in her hands. She said that no matter how you looked at it, the best option was to choose a candidate from the Valdor family, and she announced her intention to start conducting interviews. In front of her was a stack of applicants' autobiographies. Candidate number 1, greeting Her Majesty, assured her that the day he saw her he could not believe his eyes. He said that he could not understand whether he was seeing an angel in front of him or whether he was dreaming. Adele listened to his flattering words with boredom on her face. She thought to herself that everyone in Gottroff called her a witch. Contender number 2 was shaking all over. He said that it was a great honor for him to meet Her Majesty in person, and he admitted that he was so worried that it seemed like a dream to him. Adelaide even began to fall asleep, closing her eyes out of boredom. She thought that it also seemed like a dream to her, but only a nightmare. Number 3 tried to show his strength by cutting an apple in half in front of the Empress. The 4th insisted that he was a talented singer, and he offered to listen to him sing. Our heroine thought that they should have reviewed their resumes in advance. She collapsed tiredly on the sofa. Leaning back, Adele was sad that no one understood the main point of her announcement. The evening was drawing to a close. The Empress sat with her eyes closed and a cooling compress on her forehead. She thought that there was still no person from the Valdor Duchy. The Countess, seeing the state of the lady, said that if she was tired, the rest of the candidates could be released. The Empress was surprised that there were still people behind that door. Adelaide ordered him to come in. She already wanted to finish quickly and go to rest. The Countess came out with the list to call the next one for an interview. But then a man entered the hall, and all eyes quickly turned to him. He confidently approached Countess Giggs, and he greeted her politely and courteously. The candidates who had been sitting here all day waiting for an interview looked at each other. They were surprised that Lionel Valdor also applied for the position of advisor to the Empress. None of them knew that a representative from the Valdor family itself would respond, and they sadly realized that they had nothing to hope for here. The Countess politely answered the Duke's words of greeting. Lionel asked if he was late. Hannah replied that he would have to wait for the others since he was the last to arrive. The guy who stood in front of the Empress was sad and inactive. She found it strange that the last candidates looked lethargic and depressed. The latest candidates were completely lacking in enthusiasm, unlike many of their predecessors. Adelaide leaned back on the sofa tiredly. She was glad that it was finally over because she felt tired. The girl thought that she had just wasted her time. After all, none of the candidates were suitable to help her. The Countess came to the Empress and said that there was one more left. Adele was surprised. After all, I knew that it was already over. Hannah handed the resume of the last applicant into her hands. The girl read the applicant's profile and couldn't believe her eyes. She told the Countess to let the Duke in. A tall, slender brunette walked into the room with a confident step. He bowed modestly and greeted Her Majesty. The girl invited Knight Lionel Walder to sit down. Her face brightened considerably at his appearance. Adele restrainedly told him that she would not treat him to tea, because she had offered it to other candidates. The Duke realized that, as he thought, the Empress was not doing this for fun. Lionel asked what she wanted to achieve, assuming that she wanted to balance the power or she needed supporters. He reasoned that in the palace the Empress had no one to trust or rely on. Therefore, he assumed that she wanted to take her place in a place where everything was already taken over by other people. Lionel said that if she needed an assistant for these purposes, then no matter who she chose, She was unlikely to find a better candidate than himself. Aledia chuckled contentedly to herself, because the Duke understood her intentions perfectly. She asked what would be better to call him, a knight or a minister. He replied that Her Majesty could call him whatever she liked. The Empress could not understand one thing. After all, the Duke could send any of those close to his family, and she asked why he decided to intervene on his own and come here himself. Lionel replied that he would like to know information that was known only to Her Majesty. The Duke said that he was interested in everything that was connected with the magic tower. Adelaide thought about it. She was surprised that he thought that the information he would receive was equivalent to what he would lose by becoming her assistant. The man confirmed that this was so. The Empress was surprised that the Duke did not even doubt for a second when making a difficult choice. Adele asked if she understood him correctly, that she could call him whatever she wanted. The man confirmed it. The Empress openly told Lionel that she was looking for an assistant to create a government that could compete with the current one. She said that he understood everything correctly. She reported that for this he would have to pretend to be her concubine. She asked if he fully realized what he was signing up for now. The Duke sat in complete shock and numbness. Adele said she would call him by name and speak to him informally, assuring that this is the only way they will look like lovers. The Empress said that if he agreed, she would appoint him as her assistant. Lionel said that of course he agreed and assured that he was absolutely indifferent to conversations and gossip behind his back. He asked Her Majesty to appoint him to this position, and the girl admired the Duke. She was pleased with herself and believed that she had chosen the ideal advisor. Already in the evening, the servant reported to the Emperor about the interview for the position of assistant to Her Majesty. Carl asked who applied. He answered with a sad face that Lionel Valdor had responded to this advertisement. This greatly upset the Emperor. He asked the servant again, not believing his ears. Charles asked if his wife had chosen Duke Valdor. The servant replied that he did not know this yet, because the Empress had not yet made official statements. The Emperor went out onto the balcony to unwind and breathe in the fresh evening air. He remembered how his wife emanated a mysterious sweet smell that could not leave his head. He remembered once again how Adelaide came to him and offered to share a meal with her. That time he was intoxicated by her smell, and if she had agreed then, the Emperor would have sent Dion to his place and spent the night with his wife. Then he could watch how a woman born into prosperity would slowly weaken before his eyes. Then he would have watched without missing a single moment as her arrogant gaze gradually faded away. The Emperor mentally asked his wife whether it was really so difficult to simply be and exist, like a feather on a pen or like a flower in a vase. He believed that it was not so bad to live calmly and carefree. Carl was wondering how he could tame the animal, which bared its teeth and showed its claws. He understood that in order to do this, it was necessary to deprive her of the ability to resist by tearing out her fangs. And our heroine took a handful of water in her palms and poured it over herself. Adele was taking a warm bath. She wanted to relax a little after a hard day and relieve fatigue. The Countess came in to see her. The Empress said that she was just about to leave. Hannah gloomily said that the mistress should have rushed this a little. The girl anxiously asked the girl what had already happened. Countess Giggs reported that His Majesty had come to see her. She assumed that apparently the Emperor had heard rumors that Lionel Valdor was here, and now her husband wanted to talk to her about it. Adele believed that she still needed to hear why her husband came here. Soon our heroine was dressed in a dress in green tones. Her shoulders were bare and her hair was loose. She entered the room a little timidly, not knowing what awaited her. The Emperor was already waiting for her. Carl sat on the living room sofa, watching his wife's movements with his eyes. Adelaide sat down on the sofa opposite her husband. She said that his arrival was sudden for her, and she explained that that's why she needed time to prepare. The girl, wanting to get straight to the point, asked what brought him here. Carl asked who she wanted to choose as her assistant. She brushed off the fact that she had not yet decided and did not know herself. And then she indignantly asked why she had to tell him about this. But the Emperor insisted on his wife's answer as to whom she decided to choose. He demanded an immediate and clear answer from her. The girl recalled that he did not ask her permission when he chose his concubine. She believed that whoever she chose was entirely her own decision, and she assured that her husband should not have tried to find out this from her. Hannah helpfully refilled the tea. The Emperor asked his wife if her choice had fallen on Lionel Valdor. She retorted, answering him defiantly and vaguely. Carl demanded that she choose someone else. The girl did not agree to make concessions to him. He said that the Valdors were against the imperial palace, and he was surprised how his wife could appoint one of them as her assistant. He believed that by her actions she exposed their family to ridicule. He asked Adele not to forget about her responsibilities. The girl laughed because her impudence amazed her husband. She recalled his recent phrase, where he compared it to a feather on a pen or flowers in a vase, and she asked if he really thought this would happen. The emperor replied that it would be so. Adelaide clenched her teeth in anger. She was sure that her husband apparently needed a decoration to hang, and it had to be with a precious stone. The girl asked if he needed a person without an opinion, who would indulge all his whims. Carl confirmed the correctness of her guesses, and he praised her for her understanding. Adele recalled that he was interested in her choice, and she said that she had just made it. Smiling defiantly, she said that she would choose Lionel Valdor. The emperor clenched his teeth in anger, but his wife recalled his words. "She is my beloved, so leave her alone, and I will not worry about your beloved." Adele said that she would remind him if he had already forgotten, and she promised to follow his words, assuring him that he should not worry about her advisor. Carl asked if his wife was really going to challenge him in this way. The girl calmly drank tea. She answered him negatively, and she assured him that over the past 4 days she had looked at everyone, but she didn't like any of them. The man was seething with rage. He shouted at his wife so that she knew her place. Adele was all calm. She answered directly, looking into the emperor's eyes, that she was not going to become his thing. The girl was surprised that she was required to fulfill her duties, and she asked him if he fulfilled his own when he did not recognize her as his equal. The emperor had nothing to answer his wife. He turned his back to her and hurried to leave her living room. Without turning to Adele, he advised her to make a wise decision, so that she would not have to regret it later. At this moment, our heroine remembered her mother. The queen advised her to act wisely and always think about the consequences. The girl thought that her mother was like her husband in this way, and she was surprised that how could she be lucky to have such people, or simply only this type of people could take the throne. She wanted to be wise and make sound decisions. Leaving the room, the emperor encountered Countess Giggs in the corridor. He asked the woman whether she was faithful to the person or her position. Charles said that he became emperor as the son of a miserable servant, and he assumed that the countess must have been offended that it was all just because of gender. He thought that she believed that Elizabeth's place had been taken away from him, but Hannah assured His Majesty that this was not so. The monarch asked to tell the empress that in order to survive in this empire, she would have to try to please him. He assured the nanny that this was the only way for Adelaide to keep her place. The empress sat on the sofa with her eyes closed, her head propped up on her fist. She was deep in thought. Her Majesty's peace was disturbed by Countess Giggs entering. The girl opened her eyes and asked what Hannah had to tell her. The woman said that she was the manager of the imperial palace by appointment of the former empress, and also Grand's nanny. She said that at the same time she was looking after another child. Few people knew about this because everything was kept in the strictest confidence, and this child was the current emperor. Adele sincerely could not understand why the countess was telling her about this now. Hannah assured that somewhere in the depths of the emperor's soul there was still a child hidden. He dreamed so much of being loved, but he was never able to achieve this. The emperor remained that vulnerable child who never knew a bright feeling. His concubine was already hurrying towards Carl. The blonde was incredibly happy to meet her beloved, but seeing his gloomy appearance, Diane became alarmed for His Majesty. She hurried to ask what happened to him. The emperor was clearly angry and upset about something at that moment. The girl suggested that the empress was to blame for having again disappointed him with her action. She asked if it was connected with Her Majesty's new assistant. The blonde expressed her indignation at how the empress dared to acquire an assistant when her husband was nearby. Carl hardly listened to her. He leaned toward the open neckline of the girl's dress and sucked in a loud breath. Dina was embarrassed by this unexpected action of the emperor. He muttered to himself, "Not that smell." The concubine asked him in surprise what had happened. Carl ordered the girl to live an incredibly calm life like a feather on a pen or like a flower in a vase, and she looked at him incomprehensibly with her huge blue eyes. The girl, smiling, asked if she became a feather, would he use her? And if she became a flower in a vase, would he put her next to him? Diane gently stroked the emperor's cheek and said that she agreed if in this way she could be close to him, because it was so important to her. Carl touched the concubine's lips. He said that's exactly what she is, and the girl predicted that soon his violet eyes would fill with tears and turn red. She bit his finger, but the man suddenly broke away from the concubine, leaving her completely bewildered. She asked him where he was going. Carl was approaching the door. Diane was surprised by his behavior. After all, he always easily succumbed to her temptations. She couldn't understand what was happening to him now. Hannah Giggs spent a long time telling her story. She said that when the previous empress found out that her maid had given birth to the emperor, she was extremely shocked. And it turned out that the prince, cut off from his own mother, lived in Her Majesty's palace without her consent. When this little boy found out that the empress hated him because he was a stranger, he was only 6 years old. At the age of 7, the prince met his real mother, but she already had one foot in the grave at that time. And then the inner core of this unfortunate child was broken. Adele was discovering her husband in a new way. She admitted that before she did not understand why he had such a hostile attitude towards everything. The girl realized that Charles saw her as the previous empress. She couldn't even imagine that he still had regret and resentment, everything connected with the word empress. The Countess said that his hostility manifests itself on an instinctive level, and she didn't think that he doubted the correctness of his actions. Adele was extremely surprised. After all, this man was the ruler of a huge empire, and she couldn't understand whether it was normal for his instincts to take over his mind. Hannah said that the man was the emperor, and Adele was called his wife. The brunette asked whether it was really through this that she should try to please him in everything. She was surprised that the Countess was trying to tell her this. The girl nervously tapped her finger on her knee. She said that on the day of her arrival, Diane Poitiers visited her. Then she began to tell her about the emperor's preferences. The Countess agreed that this was unheard of impudence. She was surprised how the impudent person could even dare. Adele insisted that she had the audacity to advise her how she should behave with the emperor. She restrainedly asked how the Countess's words differed from the words of Diane Poitiers. Hannah Giggs looked down, and ashamedly she asked to forgive her. The girl assured that the most valuable thing she had and that she wanted to protect it was herself. Adelaide said that her principles, her beliefs, her pride and honor were all she had. The girl assured that for her all this was higher than the title of the emperor himself, and that's why she agreed to die rather than become a puppet in someone else's hands, fulfilling someone else's whims. After these words, Countess Giggs realized that Adelaide was born Princess Gottroff and had blue blood flowing in her. Therefore, she should not have crossed the line of what is permitted. Hannah timidly and restrainedly asked Her Majesty to forgive her, realizing that she had made a grave mistake in subordination. The night shrouded the palace in its cloak. Only the radiance of distant stars fell like a faint reflection on the exquisite architecture of the building. Suddenly, the silhouette of a tall and strong blonde man appeared in the corridors of the castle. Countess Giggs was surprised that the emperor appeared here at such a late time. Hannah informed His Majesty that his wife had just fallen asleep, and she thought that not even an hour had passed since he left the Empress's palace. Carl sternly asked if the Empress was ready to spend the night with him today. The Countess briefly expressed surprise. The Emperor suggested that since she was so slow to give a direct answer, apparently it was possible. He hurried into Adele's room without making a report. The girl was sitting on the bed, her legs tucked under her, dressed in a nightdress. The brunette was indignant at the unexpected visit of her husband, and she asked him what he allowed himself. Carl replied that he would like to give her time. The Emperor was unbuttoning the buttons on his clothes. He was the one who always got what he wanted, and he did not need to deny himself and hesitate, even if his rival was the Empress. Soon his white doublet fell from his shoulders to the floor. The man stood in front of his wife with his torso bare. He said that she looked at him as if she was ready to kill him here and now. Adele said that she had already talked to him about everything earlier, and he then left the palace. But why did he suddenly return to finally spend a night of love with her? Carl approached the girl. He recalled that she herself asked to be recognized as his equal, and he said that in order to do this, the wedding night must happen. He said that he saw her desire to gain strength and power in the palace, and he considered it unnecessary to seek help from someone else. The monarch leaned towards his wife, inhaling her scent. He assured her that it was the Empress's duty, and having completed it, she will get what she wants. Carl promised to personally give his wife power, but she asked to let her go. Her husband called her capricious. After all, she did not want to fulfill her duty, but at the same time she intended to have power in the palace. The girl thought to herself that whether she wanted it or not, he was her legal husband, and intimacy between them was the norm. However, she couldn't understand why she felt so disgusting then now. Carl asked what she couldn't accept, and that was offensive to her. He asked if there was a person in this empire besides him, before whom she could bow. The girl was surprised that the Empress had to kneel before her husband. She gritted her teeth and insisted that this was the first time she had heard of such a thing, and she suggested that Egmont had outdated concepts. Then Carl began to gently caress her foot, rising higher and higher to her knee. The Emperor pressed his cheek to his wife's shin, continuing his caresses. He smelled her foot and kissed her. Adele abruptly stopped his actions. She removed her leg and asked what she intended to do. The Emperor asked if his wife was now happy. After all, he submitted to her and kissed her foot. The man caressed her face, touched her lips with his fingers. The girl remained tense. She demanded that he let her go and remove his hands. Carl was surprised that she did not know her place, and he assured her that all she had was her pride. He turned away from Adele, and he blamed her for flaunting her principles and baring her teeth like a wild animal. He couldn't understand what she was even thinking about. The Emperor ordered his wife to bow her head before him and submit to him. The girl answered briefly and forcefully, "No, never." The man already at the door told her over his shoulder that she would regret it very soon. Soon the door closed behind the monarch, and our heroine was left alone. She sat on the bed in complete confusion and despair. Adele remembered how the concubine sharply answered her that because the Empress had followed her advice, but something had not gone according to plan, and now she was running away. The Emperor told her not to expect anything from him, but to simply live like feathers on a pen. And the Empress's mother told her daughter that she told her not to do things that she would have wished. Adele was lying on the bed. She realized that she was dreaming. A female voice asked Her Majesty if she had woken up yet. The girl asked what happened. She was carrying a glass of water in her hand. The Countess hesitated. Hannah reported that His Majesty had cancelled the order for the additional budget assigned to her palace. The girl thought bad words at him. She thought that he behaved like a little offended boy, and she decided to play along with him. Soon news of the cancellation of the Empress's maintenance spread with incredible speed. After some time, the Empress made an official statement about the appointment of Lionel Valdor to the position of advisor to the Empress. This was her response. The maids heatedly discussed that the young master had become an assistant to the Empress. One of them suggested that the Duke might have forced him to take the job. The third denied her assumption, and she said that there was a rumor that he had given in on his own. The first one couldn't believe her ears. The gray-haired man was adjusting Lionel's clothes. He asked why he made such a decision. The brunette replied that they were now in a hopeless situation. He believed that in this case any method was suitable. He replied that he thought so, that this decision was personally made by Lionel. The Duke assured that his brother would not force him to do this, and he said with a sigh that it was time for him to go. Adele was lying on the sofa. She told herself that the fresh wind and autumn were the perfect time to talk. The maids were busy in the castle, wiping off the dust and putting things in order. The girls were tense all the time. Her Majesty frightened them. It seemed to them that she was constantly watching them. Countess Giggs watched her mistress from afar. She believed that such a despotic image suited her, and she noticed that she didn't miss anything. Hannah told the servants that they might already be free. The girls were happy about the end of working hours. When they left, Adele quietly asked her assistant if these maids began to report less ivory to the palace. The Countess said discreetly that none of them had visited that place for the past week. The girl believed that there was simply nothing to tell. Although last night was quite an interesting event, their conversation was interrupted by a maid. She entered with a report to Her Majesty that Lionel Valdor's assistant had arrived. The Empress ordered him to be invited. The brunette politely greeted Her Majesty, bowing to her. Adele stood up and walked towards the guest. She said hello and said that she was waiting for him. The Empress ordered the maids to serve them tea. The girls timidly accepted Her Majesty's order. When they were alone, Adele said that soon rumors would spread throughout the palace that a very warm relationship had arisen between them. The girl assured that he was very nice to her as an assistant, and she said that she was counting on him very much. Adele flirtatiously said that she also did not like to pretend that she and he were close, and in order not to embarrass her, next time I would like to hear an answer from him. She insisted that she did not want there to be talk that the Empress was unrequitedly in love. Lionel was somewhat taken aback and did not know what to answer. The Duke discreetly expressed the hope that Her Majesty would not regret choosing him. The girl was amused that she was not talking seriously. but he fell for it. She replied that she would try to remember his words. Lionel modestly drank tea. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being joked about. The Empress pushed a dish of sweets towards him. She offered him a treat. She said that she liked those in Egmont the most. The brunette said that there was no need to bother. Adele shrugged and took a bite. She assured that it was not difficult to offer sweetness, and she said that she had always been like this. But here she did not have the opportunity to show her true self. The Empress summed up that it turned out that his duchy wanted to appropriate for itself part of the power that belonged to a detachment of magicians. Lionel replied that it was so rude. He added that he would also like to change the way the towers are dealt with. After all, at the moment the magicians owned all the information, and they did not disseminate it. The Empress summed up that the towers were power. Adele remembered that her mother wanted this too. She said that if this power was used correctly, the members of the imperial family would become rich. But she believed that taking possession of information and keeping it secret, creating a rescue squad of magicians, giving them the opportunity to choose who to save and who not, was at least strange. She said they have the same goal. And to begin with, she was going to take advantage of the fact that she was a magician, strengthening her position in Egmont with his help. She said there was a matter that needed to be dealt with. Lionel suggested that if we were talking about canceling the additional budget for her palace, then his duchy would submit a petition to His Majesty. The Empress said that she was pleased to hear that. But she believed that such a gentle protest could not be called revenge, and since Karl dared to insult her in this way, she had to repay him in the same coin. The girl handed the paper to her assistant. She asked him to read it first. After a pause, he was surprised that she wanted to take revenge in such a way. The maids told the plump man that they had not invited him today. He said that he knew. He made a broad gesture with his hand and said that Her Majesty should choose what she liked, and he said that Madame Poitiers sent him. The man was unfolding a paper folded in 4. He said that the Ivory Palace paid all the bills, and he said that there was a letter attached. The Empress took the paper in her hands and began to familiarize herself with its contents. Countess Giggs asked Her Majesty what was written there. Adele said that was the price for 1 horse, and she was surprised that the concubine offered her to choose something for the amount that she initially allocated to her. And Diane informed her in a letter that a national holiday would soon take place. The Empress said sarcastically that she was moved to tears by her concern. Our heroine asked herself how much longer Diane Poitiers was going to provoke her, and she said out loud that she would no longer tolerate her antics. She said that she was going to write an order, and she ordered Hannah to prepare the relevant documents. The girl rubbed her forehead. She thought that in an instant she was losing control of herself. The Duke was surprised that the Empress was going to evict Diane of Poitiers from her palace. She indignantly asked what he proposed to do himself in her place. Lionel assured that if Her Majesty put the concubine on the street right now, everyone would begin to have compassion for her. The girl asked in confusion what she should do in this case. He told Adelaide a different method to resolve the issue of having an unwanted person living in the neighborhood. In conclusion, the Duke asked the Empress how she liked this method. The girl said that His Majesty was so cruel. She wondered how he could cancel additional funding, and she assumed that the Empress was very upset by this. Diane told the servant that that's why she sent him, so that she would understand that with the amount she assigned to her, she could buy at least what she needed. And a couple of months later, they celebrated a national holiday. Smiling and adjusting the necklace around her neck, the concubine said that she was also upset about this for Her Majesty. Closing her eyes languidly, the girl said that the Emperor gave her that budget and told her to buy whatever she wanted. The servant told her that she was beautiful, both externally and internally, and it was not surprising that he loved her. Diane was already accustomed to the flattery of others. She was often admired, suggesting that His Majesty was falling more and more in love with her every day. The blonde asked the servant not to say that and not to put her in an awkward position. At the same time, she tried on a gold ring on her finger. And I thought that now the Empress would understand who was in charge in the palace. Lionel asked Her Majesty what her opinion was about the method he proposed. The Empress replied that she was surprised. She admitted to herself that she had not thought that the Duke would present this plan to her with such a calm face. Adelaide even fell in love with this strong-willed and rather reserved brunette. She suggested out loud that he had personally nominated himself to become her assistant. He replied that he had already said this before. The Duke said that he intended to make a formal protest at today's meeting about the cancellation of the additional budget for Her Majesty's palace. She replied that she would wait. The Empress was holding a book in her hand. She invited her assistant to fight together. Diane was sitting on the sofa in front of a table with jewelry, perfume, and accessories. She could not understand what was happening to her, and why she was so anxious in her soul. Now her heart was beating faster, and just a minute ago everything was fine. Then she chose jewelry for herself, listened to the compliments of the merchants, and everything was fine. She remembered that last night the Emperor suddenly came to her, but then he left. And after a short period of time he returned again. Carl fell asleep without even touching his beloved. And now she was rushing around the room and could not understand why he changed his attitude towards her, and why he did something that he had not allowed himself to do before. She was at a loss. Diane called the maid to her. Lorraine quickly responded to her mistress's call. The girl ordered to immediately bring the maid from the Empress's palace, but she demanded that it be done quietly and secretly from everyone. Soon, servants from Empress Adelaide's inner circle were brought to Diane Poitier's chambers. The concubine asked her if Carl was with the Empress yesterday. The maid asked again. The blonde fiercely grabbed her by the shoulders and began to shake her forcefully and demand that she answer her question directly. The girl stammered and confirmed that he had come. Diane demanded that the servants quickly answer how many times the Emperor had been there. She answered tremblingly that he had been there twice. The blonde demanded to tell in detail what time he was in the Empress's palace. The girl said it was in the evening. Once he appeared immediately after the Empress had taken a bath, and he came out very angry. But an hour later he returned, and after staying for a few minutes, he left. Dina turned away, trying to hide her emotions. She realized that before coming to her, Carl visited his wife, and after her, without shame, he returned to her again. The blonde knew his excited violet eyes and nervous breathing. This face was familiar to her. Only she knew him. Dina was saddened. After all, from now on it was supposed to remain that way. Her hands, clenched into fists, were shaking. The girl sadly tried to understand why the Emperor no longer belonged to her. She went to the mirror. Looking at her reflection, she noticed that she had wrinkles and her face had stopped shining. Diane touched her face with her fingers. She thought that the Emperor loved her skin, and she should have called not merchants, but people who knew how to take care of themselves. The girl felt her sides, checking to see if she had gained excess weight. She calmed down a little, making sure that this was not the case. Diane asked herself why she could not get pregnant, because both the Emperor and she were absolutely healthy. Adele wrote with a pen on paper. The Countess reported to her that a maid had been called from the Ivory Palace. The Empress suggested that apparently the concubine was interested in the details of last night. Hannah asked if she should hire another servant. The brunette looked up from her papers and looked at the Countess. She asked if she had anyone in mind. The woman replied that if necessary, she could find reliable people. Adele said there is no need to do this. After all, no matter who they bring, this person will not inspire trust. She said they'd better know who was whose puppet. And she put her stamp on her first order as Empress. The man reported to the Emperor and members of the aristocratic society of the Empire that at this time the inhabitants of Count Kelvin's territory will be evacuated to the neighboring county of Beruthold, and Count Beruthold, together with Viscount Orlean, will stop the danger. According to preliminary data, the tower was on the 3rd level, and the information that gargoyles had appeared was confirmed. Lennox asked who set the 3rd danger level. He assumed that eyewitnesses might have just seen Gagner's. After all, the gargoyle was very difficult to catch. The young magician Poitiers said that there were not even magicians there, and questioned how the insignificant knights could fight them. One of those present became embittered by Lennox's remarks towards the knights. He said that he could only sit and put on airs, instead of dealing with this matter himself. The blue-eyed youth bared his teeth. He said that the opponent seemed to be running into trouble, but his senior colleague asked the guy to calm down, and reminded of the presence of His Majesty. Lennox timidly and ashamedly asked forgiveness from His Majesty. Carl asked what their Minister of Defense thought about this. And he thought that something infuriated him and always didn't like him. But today he annoyed him even more. The Emperor said that he hoped for his wise answer. Those present froze in anticipation of Lionel Valdor's speech. He said that before answering, he would like to ask a question to the responsible persons of the magic squad. The Emperor allowed it. The Duke recalled the day when the tower descended onto the palace, and he and the knights were waiting for the magicians to arrive. Lionel said that while the tower was slowly descending, a man suddenly appeared whom he did not expect to see. It was the Empress. Carl clenched his teeth in anger. He thought how impudently dared to mention her name in his presence. The Duke said that Her Majesty rose up and before the portal touched the ground, she destroyed it. And thanks to her, not a single monster managed to get out and they did without losses. Lionel claimed that no one had even thought of such a method of destroying the towers in Ekmonant. Lennox sarcastically replied that this was expected of Duke Valdor, and it was not surprising to him that he was so knowledgeable, apparently having received enough of the Empress's love. The Duke did not pay attention to the young blonde's remarks. He claimed that, according to the Empress, when monsters appear, the tower reaches the 3rd level, and it was she who told Count Kelvin to evacuate the residence. He said that the Empress also made a donation to help save people. Those present were surprised that the Empress provided financial support in the form of gold. Lionel said that he would therefore exactly repeat Her Majesty's question. Why are the magicians of Ekmont watching this situation from the sidelines? He asked the magicians whether it was their reluctance or lack of opportunity as such. Lennox and the Count were amazed and simply indignant with rage. The Duke continued his speech. What he, as Minister of Defense, would like to say is to save people. And if it was possible to help them with something, it was necessary to immediately send a detachment of magicians there. Carl was deep in thought. The advisor replied that he would personally like to hear Her Majesty's opinion. He said that if the Empress treated this situation with such noble intentions, then she legally had the right to maintenance, and he asked to share with them the reason for canceling funding for the Empress's palace. Carl muttered through his teeth that Lionel became her lover and immediately gained courage. The Emperor said angrily that he, in the person of the Minister of Defense, had warmed a snake on his chest. He said that even among common people it was customary that the wife should help her husband. Lionel listened silently to the Emperor without giving a response. The advisor, meanwhile, hinted to His Majesty that he was overdoing it. Their meeting was interrupted by an employee entering. Approaching, he informed His Majesty that the Empress had revoked permission for Diane Poitiers to reside in the Ivory Palace. Carl was surprised that his wife approved such an order. And on the paper was the seal of the Empress. Lennox said that couldn't happen. After all, the Emperor himself personally gave Diane permission. He realized that the Empress was trying to throw out his sister. And the employee said that according to palace legislation, Her Majesty has the right to approve residence orders independently. And as a sign of gratitude for the fact that Diane accompanied the Emperor all this time and coped with the affairs of the palace, Her Majesty allows Poitiers to continue living in the palace. But in order not to contradict the law, she was not part of the imperial family and does not have a certain status or position. If Diane, being the daughter of a count, had a desire to stay in the palace, she was awarded guest status by the Empress herself, and Her Majesty allowed her to stay in the Ivory Palace. But all further expenses that concerned Diane Poitiers had to be paid by her county. Lennox couldn't believe his ears. He could not imagine that it was necessary to pay such a huge amount. The Emperor nervously left the meeting room, and the board members began to whisper that the Empress was essentially right. After all, it was strange that some girl occupied the entire palace for no apparent reason. Another said that she was still very generous, since she allowed Diane to stay on the condition that she would pay for her accommodation. Young Poitiers considered them bastards for daring to open their mouths. The advisor quietly asked Lionel if it was his idea to receive payment for the Ivory Palace. He slyly replied that his brother knew him best. The guy thought that he would squeeze all the juice out of him. He knew that his brother's plans were always well calculated. Lionel told his brother that they had something to talk about in private. Meanwhile, Carl was in a hurry to the Empress's palace. He entered without a report, abruptly throwing open the doors. The maids were afraid only of his gloomiest appearance. The girls timidly greeted His Majesty. He didn't even glance in their direction. The blonde hurried up the stairs. Adelaila, already dressed in a dark blue cloak, stood majestically on the upper flight. Carl muttered through his teeth, asking the Empress where she was going in this form. The girl quickly and gracefully walked down the steps. Having caught up with her husband, she asked what issue he had come to her about. The Emperor threateningly demanded that she cancel the order to live in the Elephant Palace. Adele firmly replied that it should be his move first. She asked if he had found an error in the document. She said that she was not kicking Diane out at all and even made concessions to her in order to settle her here legally. Cart said dryly that he would not speak anymore, and he said to cancel the decree right now. The Empress replied that he first had to correct the current situation, and she said that she was shocked today by the proposed price for one horse. She said that merchants came on behalf of Diane so that she could choose something for herself. The girl said that a well-known proverb in Egmont says, "If someone points a sword, boldly draw yours." Adele looked straight into the Emperor's eyes. She thought that he was now no longer able to stop her and could not take something away. After all, he initially did not give her anything. Karl grabbed his wife by the shoulders and began shouting to ask her where she was going now. The Empress calmly replied that she was going to take a walk incognito. Adele said that the palace law, Article 14, Chapter 2, states that the Empress has the right to move secretly without the Emperor's permission, and may not notify the direction and purpose. The blonde said angrily that she clearly remembered that damn law from beginning to end. The girl asked what else she could afford, because even the allocated budget was the price of one horse. She asked to be released. She said that she was interested in the life of ordinary people in Egmont. She asked not to tell her that it was pointless. I thought it was better than sitting here in the dark. As Adele left at the door, she told her husband without looking back that her trip would take about 3 days. The Emperor thought that he would like to stop her, and I would like to hang a chain around her neck. He would like to forcefully hold her so that she could not move without permission, and put your nose against her white neck. I longed to deeply inhale her scent, like a spring flower. But now this situation angered the Emperor because it was out of his control. A man was waiting at the carriage. Adele, dressed in a traveling cloak with a hood, approached the crew. The man took off his hat and greeted her, and with trembling hands he opened the door of the carriage cabin. Soon the 2 Valdor brothers approached, and they asked if she was already in the carriage. He confirmed this. The advisor asked the servant to pretend that nothing had happened. He submitted to the master. Lionel entered the carriage. A charming brunette was sitting there in light trousers, high boots, and a raincoat. When the girl saw the Duke, she took off her hood and apologized for getting into his carriage without him. She told Duke Walder that she was glad to meet him, nodding to the advisor, the youngest of the brothers. He politely replied that it was a great honor for him to meet Her Majesty. She said that the Minister of Defense had probably already informed him, and if so, was not against providing her with housing for 3 days. He agreed with Her Majesty. Soon the carriage started moving. Adele, trying to remain unnoticed, carefully looked out the cabin window. Lionel noticed to himself that he had not seen her in such a robe and such boots for a long time. The brunette thought that the Empress had the perfect image to move around incognito. Adele watched what was happening through the window. She asked if this was how the common people lived in the capital. And carts were driving along the streets. Children were playing. Women were walking with shopping baskets. Everyone was busy with their own business, and life flowed calmly and without unnecessary fuss. The advisor asked Her Majesty what she thought. Adele said that people's clothes are neat and the colors match. She couldn't know what was inside, but the outside of the house looked clean. She believed that here at least it seemed that people lived decent human lives. It could not be said that this was a lower class, but rather slightly above average. The Empress said that in Gottroff this was considered a good life, and she asked how they assessed it in Egmont. The advisor said it was the same here. He confirmed that the area was middle class. He said that 10 minutes north there was a huge slum that was located across the river. Refugees who lost their homes because of the towers lived there. The guy said that this area was growing in size. The Empress was sad, that's what she thought. The advisor asked permission to find out why she invited Count Kelvin to her place. Adele said it was the least she could do for him. She assumed it had no effect. Lionel asked Her Majesty if she was involved in rescue activities when she lived in Gottroff. The Empress discreetly revealed that she was the founder and head of the organization to resist the towers in Gottroff. The men were surprised. Adele clarified that this was, of course, 6 months ago. She said that she devoted herself wholeheartedly to this matter. The girl said that before the tower touched the ground, before the monsters destroyed the population, she was obliged to destroy the tower. She insisted that only such thoughts overcame her. Then the rescued people thanked Her Majesty. After all, they survived only thanks to her dedication and abilities. And the children, smiling, presented the princess with a wreath of flowers, placing it on her head. Adele said that she still clearly remembered those incredible feelings. The Empress said that she tried to save all the people and not abandon anyone, that she retained her conscience and honor, as befits a person. Her Majesty said that this is the ideology that she put into her organization. She asked if their curiosity was satisfied. When the carriage stopped, Adelaide left the cab. She looked at everything around with curiosity, and she said that she found this estate excellent. Lionel thanked Her Majesty for the compliment. She assured that she was telling the truth as she thought. When the Walder brothers led the noble guest into the house, she turned to Lionel. She asked if there were books in his duchy. He replied that there were those who collected them, and the brother noticed to himself that Her Majesty called Lionel by name and addressed him informally. She wondered how close they were, and he was surprised that he really wanted to become her lover. Adele concluded that they should also have a library. Lionel asked if Her Majesty wanted to go there. The girl said that there was also a library in the palace, but she did not have the opportunity to visit it. She asked me to recommend a book to her. The Duke asked which genre was preferable and said that he was ready to recommend it. The girl suddenly noticed that Lionel's brother looked confused, and she suggested that he apparently only now found out that she was not officially addressing her assistant. But she still found it inconvenient to tell him that she wanted to create such a look for society. Adele turned to the advisor, suggesting that they switch to you in communication. The guy was surprised and asked again. The girl, embarrassed, corrected herself and said that she had suggested that they should go to the library. The guy was shaking a little, but he controlled himself, and he replied that the library is on the second floor. He assured Her Majesty that she could use it as much as she wanted. Lionel approached Adele and politely volunteered to take Her Majesty to the reading room. At some point, the Duke noticed that her ears were red. The girl opened up for him from the other side. Countess Giggs said that in the end, Diane Poitiers must decide. She would stay here as a guest, or return to the family estate as soon as possible. The girl looked at Hannah in shock. The woman placed a piece of paper in front of the concubine. She said that this was an official order from Her Majesty. The blonde hesitantly touched the paper. She couldn't believe that the Empress was now kicking her out of her own palace. And at the bottom of the order was the personal seal of the Empress. Diane clarified that she was being kicked out of her palace. The Countess said with restraint that there were good reasons for this. The concubine said that the Emperor himself allowed her to stay. The woman, wise from life experience in the imperial palace, shouted at the concubine that she did not dare to challenge the order of the Empress, and she reminded her that she was obliged to show her respect. The blonde thought that she was already fed up with her Empress. She said that until she heard His Majesty's order, she would never leave this palace. The Countess asked the concubine that her remark should be understood as a desire to rent the palace, and she said that she would calculate all the expenses and send her an invoice. She told me to pay at the end of each month. Diane was furious. Hannah calmly said that issues related to living in the palace were decided by the Empress according to the law, and she had every right to give orders without the consent of her husband. The Countess assured that soon all the maids of the Ivory Palace would be assigned to other places. The blonde started screaming that it was all nonsense. The woman calmly said that the right to distribute servants within the palace was also in the hands of Her Majesty. And she thought that Diane still did not understand that stupid love turns into nothing against the backdrop of the law. Hannah turned around and headed towards the exit. The blonde shouted after her to stop. She held the Countess by the shoulders and ordered her to tell Her Majesty that if she dared to treat her like that, she would definitely regret it. And she assured that the Emperor would not allow her to leave this place. Diane looked at the Countess, and I thought that her eyes were full of contempt. These were the eyes of an aristocrat that seemed to say, "You are a pathetic non-entity." The girl didn't want to see this before and got rid of Hannah. The concubine asked if she thought that the Emperor would leave it just like that, and she believed that he would stand up for her and would definitely intervene. The blonde said that the woman herself knew perfectly well the reason for this. The Countess touched the girl's face. She said that she had wrinkles. Hannah claimed that she had not seen her for so long, that during this time folds had formed around her eyes and mouth. She assured that soon there would be even more wrinkles on her face, because Diane had thin skin, on which age-related problems easily appear. The woman leaned over and spoke into her ear, that she knows very well the weapons that she used to be close to the Emperor. The Countess agreed that Diane definitely looked like the Emperor's mother, so much so that she even reminded her of her. The concubine could not stand the mockery and began to shout at her to stop being sarcastic like a snake. Hannah asked if the girl knew when Mrs. Beatrice died. According to her, she was 29 years old. The woman said that she looked very young, and there was not a single wrinkle on her face. The Countess said that for the Emperor, his mother will always remain a woman who is exactly 29 years old, who will never grow old. Hannah assured the concubine that she was still 29, but she would be 30 and 40. She said that time passes quickly for Diane, unlike Mrs. Beatrice. The girl covered her face with her hands. The woman assured that rather than sending merchants to the Empress, it would be better if she took care of her skin so as not to age like that before her eyes. Hannah said that she herself knew very well how many blondes with blue eyes there were in the empire, and even younger than herself. The Countess, without waiting for an answer, turned around and left the concubine, who froze in confusion from everything that was said to her. Hannah said as she left that the empire was swarming with girls with dirty intentions. Diana was finally shaken by what Countess Giggs said at the end. It seemed that her last strength was leaving her. She looked around. The luxurious and beautiful environment was thanks to her efforts. The concubine was covered with anger. She shouted that the Empress did not dare drive her out of her own palace. After all, because of the title alone, she encroached on everything that belonged to her. The girl could not understand what was in that title. She had previously told His Majesty that she wanted to become his lover. Diane spoke into the void, addressing this to the Empress that she would not succeed. She could not understand why that one name made her so pitiful and insignificant compared to the Empress. The blonde was sitting on the floor on her knees and crying. She was shaking. She asked why she couldn't have some kind of title, and why couldn't she take her rightful place next to the Emperor, because this was important to her. Suddenly, she jumped up and hurried to the mirror. She looked at her reflection and told herself that she shouldn't cry, because in this case unwanted wrinkles might appear. The concubine took a soft napkin and began to blot the skin under her eyes. Diane Poitiers told her reflection that she should not cry, but should control herself. The girl called out to the maid Lorraine and ordered her to quickly call the skincare specialists. Meanwhile, Adelaide was enthusiastically reading a book in the reading room of Duke Valdor's mansion. Lionel and his brother came in and asked Her Majesty if she would like to have dinner with them. The girl immediately closed the book. She replied that she would be happy to keep them company, admitting that she was just hungry. After the meal, the three of them drank tea. The younger Valdor asked the guest if she liked the food. He apologized, which was quite modest, since he was told to keep her presence here a secret. Adele, having sipped her tea with pleasure, answered the Duke that she was satisfied with the meal. The Empress said that they could ask her what interested them so much. The guy noticed that she was straightforward as always. Lionel asked if he could ask questions related to the destruction of the tower. The guest replied that of course it was possible. The Duke recalled that last time she said that it was a 4th-level tower, but in terms of power it was only the 5th. And he asked what happened, that she alone could destroy towers weaker than that one. Lionel said that then, in front of his eyes, she destroyed the tower before it touched the ground. He was interested in whether the same tactics were used in Gottroff. Adelaide replied that 5 years ago she accidentally discovered this method. And from then on, the #1 rule was to destroy the tower before it touched the ground. Na said that the main problem was that there were very few magicians like her who could control the upward flow. About half of the portals were destroyed before they descended to the ground. She said that she had to fight with the other half afterwards. Lionel assumed that in such cases there was a great loss of life. Adele replied that it was possible to do without sacrifices. The advisor asked how Her Majesty viewed leaving the tower, which had already descended to the ground, and was it possible to somehow deal with this? The Empress said with sadness, lowering her eyes, that this was impossible. Lionel asked for forgiveness. He placed Egmont's map on the table and unfolded it on it. The girl could not understand why he brought her here. The Duke began to place stones on the map. Soon it was all generously laid out by them. The Empress was horrified to herself, suggesting that all the red stones on this map were the places where the towers descended. Lionel confirmed this with sadness in his voice. He said that these were controlled portals. The girl thought with horror that they had been neglected and tried to be controlled. Aled said that if all these stones are the locations of the towers, then Egmont was no different from hell. The Duke said that it was so. He assured that now the Empire was in incredible horror, and asked to help them, assuring that they needed her help. Meanwhile, in the Ivory Palace, Diane Poitiers applied skincare to her face in front of the mirror. A maid came in and reported that His Majesty had arrived. The blonde beamed at the news. She hurried to put on the earrings and quickly hid the product in her desk drawer. Carl hurriedly walked along the red carpet of the corridor with a sweeping step. His gaze was unreadable. Diane came out to meet him, opening the door of her room, expecting to meet her beloved. She bowed to greet His Majesty. The Emperor noticed that the girl had lost even more weight. Her lifeless face and lips, her neck, which could break from a sudden movement, became even more fragile. She looked like someone who was about to die. His soul could not calm down. It was becoming difficult for him to breathe, as if he had fallen into a bottomless black sea. Diane thought that the man was definitely angry. She assumed that he was angry because the Empress tried to kick her out and now he was sorry to see her in such a state. The concubine assumed that the Emperor had come to console her. She touched his chest with her hands and thought that Karl loved her. The girl assured the monarch that everything was fine with her and pressed her head against his torso. But the man remained cold towards her, and he asked if she had sent the merchant to the Empress's palace. The girl asked again. Fear appeared in her eyes. Karl grabbed the concubine tightly by the shoulder. And once again he clearly asked her a question, looking straight into her eyes, whether she sent the merchant to the Empress's palace and set the price for 1 horse. Diane realized that he was not worried about her, and he showed up here to interrogate her. She replied that she felt sorry for the Empress. After all, her already small budget was cancelled. She touched his hand with a trembling hand. The blonde claimed that she was worried about how much money the Empress could buy herself dresses and jewelry. She said that she now realized that she had acted stupidly, but could not help her with anything else. She asked how she dared to do this, setting the price for 1 horse. The girl assured that she gave the merchant the amount that was initially determined. Diane said that he gave her this money. She did it without thinking, and asked for forgiveness. The Emperor pulled his hand away from hers. Shaking his forehead, he said that it was useless to provoke her, and he reminded that Dina had said before that his love was enough for her. The girl confirmed it. Karl asked her not to forget her words, and he said that as long as she remembered them, he would be able to protect her. The Emperor ordered her to vacate the Elephant Palace, and he said that he would prepare a place for her at his place. After all, the Empress did not have the right to command in the Emperor's palace. He said that if she didn't like the idea, she could return to the Poutier estate. The girl said that she couldn't do that. She asked His Majesty not to abandon her. The man snatched his hand from her. He recalled that he had previously asked her not to say that. Karl said that she was becoming more and more like his mother. He turned around and walked away from her, and the blonde remained standing all in tears. Meanwhile, a starry night was falling over the mansion of Duke Valdor. The advisor told Her Majesty that the butler would show her to her room, and if problems arose, she could contact him at any time. Adele told the man that she hoped for him, and he answered Her Majesty, which was a great honor for him. The girl said goodbye to Duke Valdor and said that they would see him tomorrow. He wished Her Majesty good dreams. The brunette said goodnight to Lionel. He answered the Empress in return. Our heroine tossed and turned in bed for a long time without sleep. She thought that many things had happened since her arrival in Egmont. She told herself that it was necessary to deal with the accumulated problems. But there were also towers. The girl got out of bed. She wondered how she could sleep at all after hearing what she had heard. Lionel couldn't sleep either. He walked around the room in a robe, his hands clenched into fists. The Duke decided to go read something, but only after opening the book, he noticed that it was light in Her Majesty's room. And I wondered why she was still awake. Suddenly someone threw a pebble at his window. The guy put down the book and went out onto the balcony. Her Majesty came out onto another balcony opposite. She waved her hand at him. Lionel suggested that something might be bothering her. Adelaide asked where she could find alcohol. Soon they were walking along the castle corridor. The girl asked the Duke why he was not sleeping at such a late hour. Lionel hesitated. He couldn't tell her directly that thoughts about her couldn't let him sleep. He was surprised that Her Majesty wanted to drink at night. The girl noticed that he abruptly changed the subject without answering her question. Adele said she couldn't sleep, and the guy edifyingly said that you shouldn't resort to alcohol every time. Lionel lit the lamps. The brunette looked at the picture. She said there was already enough lighting. She asked me to get alcohol and go. She assured me that she would sort it out herself and clean it up afterwards. The Duke specified what Her Majesty would prefer. Adelaide answered, "Whiskey." She claimed she didn't need water or ice to dilute it. She also said that she didn't need any snacks either. Lionel took a bottle from the bar. He said that in this case the whiskey would be too strong. The girl assured that everything was fine, that she always drank like that. The Duke said that Her Majesty might feel bad because this drink was very strong. The Empress ordered Lionel to stop. The brunette said that he was grouchier than she thought, and she asked if he would go to his place. The Empress poured a drink into a glass. She asked if he wanted to have a drink with her. The Duke refused, arguing that he would probably abstain. Adele asked if he was sure, and she claimed that then she would drink herself, taking a long sip from the glass. Lionel was surprised that the girl drank almost a whole glass in one sip. Placing an almost empty glass on the table, the Empress said that such a drink was very refreshing for her. She thanked Lionel. The girl said that from the very first day she was here, she had to face hostility, the reason for which she did not even know. And now I also found out about the problems with the towers. Adele said that thanks to him the situation was somehow resolved, but she insisted that she was a little tired. She poured whiskey from the bottle into her glass. Soon, again, he knocked it over almost all the way to the bottom. The girl assured that because of the flow of thoughts she could not fall asleep. That's why I decided to drink some alcohol. Lionel said that he may be crossing the line, but he would like to say that she approaches problems very wisely, and he insisted that he respected that about her. The girl again poured herself some alcohol. She thanked the Duke for such words addressed to her, and she said that she felt better, again sipping whiskey from her glass. The brunette, smiling slightly, said that he was glad that he could help her at least a little. The girl noticed the painting on the wall, and she asked if it was a family portrait. Lionel confirmed this. She asked if he was that cute little boy on her. Adele said that there he seemed more alive and energetic. The Duke replied that his father often said that his son was still that prankster, and he said that he also had the habit of often, but moderately, misbehaving, and this made his father even more irritated. The girl laughed, imagining Lionel as a prankster, and she said that she would have been interested in meeting him at that age. She supposed he was incredibly sweet. The Duke said that he was glad that he had met Her Majesty now. She asked why this was so. Lionel said that if he were still a child, he would not have been able to become her assistant, that then he wouldn't even be on the list of candidates. Adele laughed cheerfully at his words, and she asked how he came up with this, and she said that even if he had not become an advisor, he would have been there and made her happy. The Duke looked at her rosy cheeks, her eyes that reflected the moonlight. The cold-blooded Empress, who seemed to dominate the empire, laughed because of such a trifle. Now in Lionel's eyes, Her Majesty was simply a beautiful woman. They sat opposite each other and smiled, but then the Empress chuckled, and the Duke asked himself what he had just thought about. The girl noticed the Duke's embarrassment and the fact that he suddenly blushed and became embarrassed. Adele suggested it might have been due to alcohol, but then I thought that he looked quite attractive. She told Lionel that if he was interested in something, he should not hesitate to ask her, and he said that he would answer one question that he would not dare to ask the Empress, as payment for alcohol. The Duke recalled that she said that she was responsible for the removal of the towers in Gotroff, but he could not understand why she then decided to agree to marry the emperor of such a distant country, and left for Egmont. Adele sighed and said that he decided to take it big. The brunette said that if she didn't want to answer, that was her desire. He apologized if he was rude by asking her such a personal question. The Empress said a portrait of her family also hangs in Gotroff, and anyone will see love and harmony in him. She wondered if Brother Lucio had received her letter. The girl said that her father died suddenly due to illness. Their empire was in chaos. Therefore, her mother invited her to marry and sent her to Egmont, and even her organization did not become a good reason for the Queen to refuse. Adelaide said that in fact she couldn't even refuse. After all, it was her fault too. Lionel wondered what happened to Her Majesty if she was telling this with such a gloomy face. He did not understand what the Empress wanted to say, but did not question her further. The girl stood up, leaning her hand on the table. She said she had already given back. She invited Lionel to return. Only the brunette asked himself the question whether Her Majesty had been so short before. A man was pouring red wine into a glass. He sat on the couch and drank alcohol alone. He remembered how he sat on the throne as a child, and everyone congratulated him on his coronation. The Duke said that from now on Charles became the most respected aristocrat of this country. But the boy remained sad. The magician said that he would bring the world to his feet, and he will have everything he wants. The emperor put his empty glass on the table. He asked himself why on such days he remembered those times more and more clearly.